The Open Society and Its Enemies underscore Volume 1, Karl R. Popper. Volume I of Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, 1945. The Spell of Plato, diagnoses historicism and tribal reaction in the Greek crisis that produced the closed city as a political ideal. From Heraclitus and the forms through Platonic justice, leadership, and utopian engineering to the Open Society's birth and enemies. This summary reconstructs the argument in Popper's critical rationalist register. Abstract. Volume I of Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, The Spell of Plato, traces how historicism, the belief that history is governed by discoverable laws of destiny, took shape in the Greek crisis that produced both the Open Society and its enemies. From the myth of the chosen people and Heraclitus' Fluxion law through Plato's theory of forms, law of decay, totalitarian justice, philosopher king, and utopian social engineering, Popper argues that Plato's arresting philosophy is a totalitarian response to the strain of civilization, a spell cast over the revolt against freedom by one who betrayed Socrates. Against the closed city, Popper sets the great generation of Pericles, Protagoras, and Socrates, the convention/nature distinction, protectionist individualism, and democratic criticism of democracy. He concludes that we cannot return to tribal innocence, but must face the uncertain path of piecemeal reform, critical rationality, and institutions that prevent tyranny rather than anointing the wisest ruler. Executive summary. Central thesis. Western civilization has not recovered from the shock of its birth. The transition from the closed, tribal society to the open society that frees critical reason and totalitarianism is the perennial attempt to answer that strain by arresting change and restoring certainty through historicist prophecy and utopian blueprints. In Volume I, Popper locates the classical source of this spell in Plato, a sincere diagnosis of social dissension and unhappiness joined to a program of natural class rule, essentialist politics, propaganda, educational monopoly, and canvas-cleaning violence that implicates Socrates while opposing the equalitarian, conventionalist, protectionist achievements of democratic Athens. The future depends on ourselves, not on destiny. Rational politics means piecemeal institutional reform guarded by democratic checks, not prophecy or the rule of possessors of truth. Foundational observations. Historicism and prophecy. The social sciences cannot justify sweeping prophecies of mankind's fate. Historicism flatters initiates, discourages reform, and may relieve men of responsibility. Yet persists because it expresses dissatisfaction with a world that cannot live up to moral dreams of perfection. Flux, decay, and arrest. Heraclitus discovers change, yet clings to cosmic law. Plato adds a law of degeneration and perfect forms, then seeks a state that does not change, the arrested Golden Age state as remedy for democratic revolution. Methodological essentialism. Plato's forms enables scientific political knowledge by positing hidden essences of state, justice, and man. Popper contrasts this with describing institutional behavior and warns that essentialism dominates backward social science. Totalitarian justice and class nature. Justice becomes the harmony of a naturally divided whole. Equalitarianism and protectionism are reinterpreted as chaos or selfishness. Humanitarian rhetoric masks the re-establishment of tribal hierarchy. Who should rule? Plato's question invites sovereignty of the best and diverts attention from institutional safeguards. Democracy should be understood as anti-tyranny, removable government, criticism, and equalitarian control methods rather than authoritative truth of majorities. Socrates versus Plato. Socratic intellectualism is equalitarian, anti-dogmatic, and democratically critical. Platonic education selects obedient believers, monopolizes truth, and makes the Republic's Socrates an authoritarian spokesman Plato's teacher would have rebuked. Philosopher king and noble lies. The ruler as possessor of truth, breeder of a master race, and administrator of propaganda, including the myth of the metals, with inquisition reserved for honest dissent. Kant's warning against philosophers as kings recurs as Popper's own. Utopian versus piecemeal engineering. blueprints of the whole society's centralized power, suppress criticism, and invite canvas cleaning. Piecemeal reform targets urgent evils, permits experiment and correction, and makes rational agreement on suffering more attainable than agreement on utopia. Open society and strain. Tribal magic yields to personal decision and conventionalist insight in the Great Generation. The patriotic reaction, old oligarch Critias, Thucydides, and Plato's aesthetic holism exploit the strain of civilization without offering a return that reason can accept. Lesson by negative example. Plato's therapy, arresting change, is worse than the disease. Paradise is lost for those who think critically, and the only human path forward is the insecure, open society sustained by reason, responsibility, and the refusal to pose as prophets. Significance and recommendation. Volume I remains indispensable for anyone who wants to understand why Platonic idealism is not a harmless aesthetic of the good, but a political theory with a totalitarian logic, and why democratic reform needs a methodological defense against historicism and utopian holism. Read it before Volume 2 if the aim is to grasp Popper's genealogy of the closed society on its own terms. Heraclitus and Plato first, modern movements later. I recommend it to students of political philosophy, classics, and totalitarianism alike, with attention to Chapters 6 to 8 on justice and leadership, Chapter 9 on engineering, and Chapter 10 on Athens as the school of the open society and its enemies. Expect demolition rather than reverence. Popper admires Plato's brilliance while arguing that the spell must be broken if piecemeal democratic reason is to do its work. Introduction. Popper opens with Kant's repudiation of the puffed-up pretentiousness of fashionable volumes filled with wisdom, a warning, I believe, that frames his own project. This book raises issues not apparent from the table of contents alone. It sketches the difficulties faced by a civilization aiming at humaneness, reasonableness, equality, and freedom. A civilization still in its infancy, growing despite repeated betrayal by intellectual leaders. The central thesis is that this civilization has not fully recovered from the shock of its birth. The transition from the tribal or closed society, with its submission to magical forces, to the open society that sets free the critical powers of man. That shock, Popper argues, made possible the reactionary movements that have tried, and still try, to overthrow civilization and return to tribalism. Totalitarianism belongs to a tradition as old or as young as civilization itself. The book thereby contributes to our understanding of totalitarianism and of the perennial fight against it. It further examines the application of the critical and rational methods of science to the problems of the open society. The principles of democratic social reconstruction, of piecemeal social engineering in opposition to utopian social engineering, and the clearing away of obstacles to a rational approach to social reconstruction. This is done by criticizing those social philosophies responsible for the widespread prejudice against democratic reform. The most powerful of these philosophies Popper calls historicism, and the story of the rise and influence of important forms of historicism is one of the book's main topics. It might even be described as a collection of marginal notes on the development of certain historicist philosophies. Historicism and the method of science. Although Popper was mainly interested in the methods of physics, he had long been concerned with the unsatisfactory state of some social sciences, and especially of social philosophy, a concern sharpened by the rise of totalitarianism and by the failure of the social sciences and social philosophies to make sense of it. One point appeared particularly urgent. One hears too often the suggestion that some form of totalitarianism is inevitable. Intelligent and trained people announce that there is no escape, that democracy is merely one form of government among many that come and go, that democracy, in fighting totalitarianism, is forced to copy its methods and thus become totalitarian itself, or that the industrial system cannot function without collectivist planning, whence the inevitability of totalitarian social life. Such arguments may sound plausible, but plausibility, Popper insists, is not a reliable guide. One should not enter into discussion of these specious arguments before considering a question of method, Is it within the power of any social science to make such sweeping historical prophecies? Can we expect more than the irresponsible reply of a soothsayer if we ask what the future has in store for mankind? This question is more fundamental than any criticism of any particular argument offered in support of any historical prophecy. A careful examination led Popper to the conviction that such sweeping historical prophecies are entirely beyond the scope of scientific method. The future depends on ourselves, and we do not depend on any historical necessity. Influential social philosophies hold the opposite view. They claim that everybody tries to use his brains to predict impending events, that it is legitimate for a strategist to foresee the outcome of a battle, and that the boundaries between such a prediction and more sweeping historical prophecies are fluid. They assert that it is the task of science in general to make predictions, and of the social sciences in particular to furnish long-term historical prophecies, that they have discovered laws of history enabling them to prophesy the course of historical events. The various social philosophies raising claims of this kind Popper groups under the name historicism. Elsewhere, in The Poverty of Historicism, he argued against these claims and showed that, in spite of their plausibility, they are based on a gross misunderstanding of the method of science, especially on the neglect of the distinction between scientific prediction and historical prophecy. The notes collected for that purpose became the basis of this book. Historicism, the doctrine that the social sciences, if they are to be of any use, must discover laws of history and furnish long-term prophecies about mankind's destiny. A view Popper holds to be based on misunderstanding the method of science. Piecemeal social engineering. Democratic social reconstruction by small, testable institutional changes, opposed to utopian schemes that claim to remake society wholesale according to a blueprint. Quote, "The future depends on ourselves, and we do not depend on any historical necessity." The functions and dangers of prophecy. The systematic analysis of historicism aims at something like scientific status. This book does not. Many opinions expressed are personal. What it owes to scientific method is largely the awareness of its limitations. It does not offer proofs where nothing can be proved, nor pretend to be scientific where it can give no more than a personal point of view. It does not try to replace old systems of philosophy by a new system, nor to add to volumes filled with wisdom and metaphysics of history and destiny. It tries to show that this prophetic wisdom is harmful, that the metaphysics of history impede the application of the piecemeal methods of science to the problems of social reform, and that we may become the makers of our fate when we have ceased to pose as its prophets. In tracing the development of historicism, Popper found that the dangerous habit of historical prophecy, so widespread among intellectual leaders, has various functions. It is flattering to belong to the inner circle of the initiated and to possess the unusual power of predicting the course of history. There is a tradition that intellectual leaders are gifted with such powers, and not to possess them may lead to loss of caste. The danger of being unmasked as charlatans is very small, since they can always point out that it is permissible to make less sweeping predictions, and the boundaries between these and augury are fluid. But there are sometimes deeper motives. Prophets who prophesy the coming of a millennium may give expression to deep-seated dissatisfaction. Their dreams may give hope to some who can hardly do without them. Yet their influence is liable to prevent us from facing the daily tasks of social life. Minor prophets who announce that certain events, such as a lapse into totalitarianism or managerialism, are bound to happen may, whether they like it or not, be instrumental in bringing these events about. Their story that democracy is not to last forever is as true, and as little to the point, as the assertion that human reason is not to last forever, since only democracy provides an institutional framework that permits reform without violence, and so the use of reason in political matters. But their story tends to discourage those who fight totalitarianism. Its motive is to support the revolt against civilization. A further motive can be found if we consider that historicist metaphysics are apt to relieve men from the strain of their responsibilities. If you know that things are bound to happen whatever you do, then you may feel free to give up the fight against them, more especially to give up the attempt to control social evils such as war, or the tyranny of the petty official. Popper does not suggest that historicism must always have such effects. There are historicists, especially Marxists, who do not wish to relieve men from the strain of their responsibilities. On the other hand, some social philosophies may or may not be historicistic, but preach the impotence of reason in social life, and by this anti-rationalism propagate the attitude: either follow the leader, the great statesman, or become a leader yourself. An attitude which for most people must mean passive submission to the forces, personal or anonymous, that rule society. Disappointed historicism and the revolt against civilization. It is interesting that some who denounce reason and even blame it for the social evils of our time do so on the one hand because they realize that historical prophecy goes beyond the power of reason, and on the other because they cannot conceive of a social science or of reason in society having any function but that of historical prophecy. They are disappointed historicists, men who, in spite of realizing the poverty of historicism, are unaware that they retain the fundamental historicistic prejudice, the doctrine that the social sciences, if they are to be of any use at all, must be prophetic. This attitude must lead to a rejection of the applicability of science or of reason to the problems of social life, and ultimately to a doctrine of power, of domination and submission. Why do all these social philosophies support the revolt against civilization? And what is the secret of their popularity? Popper is inclined to think that they give expression to a deep-felt dissatisfaction with a world which does not and cannot live up to our moral ideals and dreams of perfection. The tendency of historicism to support the revolt against civilization may be due to the fact that historicism itself is largely a reaction against the strain of our civilization and its demand for personal responsibility. These allusions are somewhat vague, but they must suffice for this introduction. They will later be substantiated by historical material, especially in the chapter The Open Society and Its Enemies. Popper was tempted to place that chapter at the beginning. With its topical interest, it would have made a more inviting introduction. But the full weight of the historical interpretation cannot be felt unless it is preceded by the material discussed earlier. One has first to be disturbed by the similarity between the Platonic theory of justice and the theory and practice of modern totalitarianism before one can feel how urgent it is to interpret these matters. Quote, "We may become the makers of our fate when we have ceased to pose as its prophets." Chapter 1. Historicism and the Myth of Destiny. It is widely believed that a truly scientific or philosophical attitude towards politics and a deeper understanding of social life in general must be based upon a contemplation and interpretation of human history. While the ordinary man takes the setting of his life and the importance of his personal experiences and petty struggles for granted, it is said that the social scientist or philosopher has to survey things from a higher plane. He sees the individual as a pawn, as a somewhat insignificant instrument in the general development of mankind. The really important actors on the stage of history are either the great nations and their great leaders, or perhaps the great classes or the great ideas. However this may be, he will try to understand the meaning of the play performed on the historical stage. He will try to understand the laws of historical development. If he succeeds, he will be able to predict future developments, put politics upon a solid basis, and give practical advice by telling us which political actions are likely to succeed or likely to fail. This is a brief description of an attitude which Popper calls historicism. It is an old idea, or rather a loosely connected set of ideas which have become, unfortunately, so much a part of our spiritual atmosphere that they are usually taken for granted and hardly ever questioned. Popper tried elsewhere to show that the historicist approach to the social sciences gives poor results and to outline a method which would yield better results. But if historicism is a faulty method that produces worthless results, it may be useful to see how it originated and how it succeeded in entrenching itself so successfully. An historical sketch undertaken with this aim can serve to analyze the variety of ideas which have gradually accumulated around the central historicist doctrine. The doctrine that history is controlled by specific historical or evolutionary laws whose discovery would enable us to prophesy the destiny of man. The doctrine of the chosen people. Historicism can be well illustrated by one of the simplest and oldest of its forms, the doctrine of the chosen people. This doctrine is one of the attempts to make history understandable by a theistic interpretation, i.e., by recognizing God as the author of the play performed on the historical stage. The theory of the chosen people assumes that God has chosen one people to function as the selected instrument of his will, and that this people will inherit the earth. In this doctrine, the law of historical development is laid down by the will of God. The specific difference distinguishing the theistic form from other forms of historicism. A naturalistic historicism might treat the developmental law as a law of nature, a spiritual historicism as a law of spiritual development, an economic historicism as a law of economic development. Theistic historicism shares with these other forms the doctrine that there are specific historical laws which can be discovered, and upon which predictions regarding the future of mankind can be based. There is no doubt that the doctrine of the chosen people grew out of the tribal form of social life. Tribalism, the emphasis on the supreme importance of the tribe without which the individual is nothing at all, is an element we shall find in many forms of historicist theories. Other forms which are no longer tribalist may still retain an element of collectivism. They may emphasize the significance of some group or collective, for example, a class, without which the individual is nothing at all. Another aspect of the doctrine of the chosen people is the remoteness of what it proffers as the end of history. Although it may describe this end with some degree of definiteness, we have to go a long way before we reach it, and the way is not only long, but winding. Accordingly, it will be possible to bring every conceivable historical event well within the scheme of the interpretation. No conceivable experience can refute it, but to those who believe in it, it gives certainty regarding the ultimate outcome of human history, from chosen people to chosen race and class. A criticism of the theistic interpretation of history will be attempted in the last chapter of the book, where it will also be shown that some of the greatest Christian thinkers have repudiated this theory as idolatry. An attack upon this form of historicism should therefore not be interpreted as an attack upon religion. In the present chapter, the doctrine of the chosen people serves only as an illustration. Its value as such can be seen from the fact that its chief characteristics are shared by the two most important modern versions of historicism, whose analysis will form the major part of this book: the historical philosophy of racialism or fascism on the one hand, and the Marxian historical philosophy on the other. For the chosen people, racialism substitutes the chosen race, selected as the instrument of destiny, ultimately to inherit the earth. Marx's historical philosophy substitutes for it the chosen class, the instrument for the creation of the classless society, and at the same time the class destined to inherit the earth. Both theories base their historical forecasts on an interpretation of history, which leads to the discovery of a law of its development. In the case of racialism, this is thought of as a kind of natural law. The biological superiority of the blood of the chosen race explains the course of history, past, present, and future. It is nothing but the struggle of races for mastery. In the case of Marx's philosophy of history, the law is economic. All history has to be interpreted as a struggle of classes for economic supremacy. Tribalism, the emphasis on the supreme importance of the tribe or collective, without which the individual is nothing, an element found in many historicist theories, from the chosen people to the chosen class. Unfalsifiability, the remoteness and winding path of the historicist end makes every conceivable event fit the scheme. No conceivable experience can refute the doctrine. The historicist character of these two movements makes Popper's investigation topical. Each of them goes back directly to the philosophy of Hegel. We must therefore deal with that philosophy as well. And since Hegel in the main follows certain ancient philosophers, it will be necessary to discuss the theories of Heraclitus, Plato, and Aristotle, before returning to the more modern forms of historicism. Quote, "History is controlled by specific historical or evolutionary laws whose discovery would enable us to prophesy the destiny of man." Chapter 2. Heraclitus. It is not until Heraclitus that we find in Greece theories which could be compared in their historicist character with the doctrine of the chosen people. In Homer's theistic, or rather polytheistic interpretation, history is the product of divine will. But the Homeric gods do not lay down general laws for its development. What Homer tries to stress and to explain is not the unity of history, but rather its lack of unity. The author of the play on the stage of history is not one god. A whole variety of gods dabble in it. What the Homeric interpretation shares with the Jewish is a certain vague feeling of destiny and the idea of powers behind the scenes. But ultimate destiny, according to Homer, is not disclosed. Unlike its Jewish counterpart, it remains mysterious. The first Greek to introduce a more markedly historicist doctrine was Hesiod, who was probably influenced by Oriental sources. He made use of the idea of a general trend or tendency in historical development. His interpretation of history is pessimistic. He believes that mankind, in their development down from the Golden Age, are destined to degenerate, both physically and morally. The culmination of the various historicist ideas proffered by the early Greek philosophers came with Plato, who painted a grandiose philosophical picture of the world. He was strongly influenced by various forerunners, especially by Hesiod, but the most important influence came from Heraclitus, the discovery of change. Heraclitus was the philosopher who discovered the idea of change. Down to this time, the Greek philosophers, influenced by Oriental ideas, had viewed the world as a huge edifice of which the material things were the building material, the totality of things, the cosmos. The questions the philosophers asked themselves were, what stuff is the world made of? Or how is it constructed? What is its true ground plan? They considered philosophy or physics, the two were indistinguishable for a long time, as the investigation of nature, i.e., of the original material out of which this edifice, the world, had been built. As far as any processes were considered, they were thought of either as going on within the edifice, or else as constructing or maintaining it, disturbing and restoring the stability or balance of a structure which was considered to be fundamentally static. This very natural approach was superseded by the genius of Heraclitus. The view he introduced was that there was no such edifice, no stable structure, no cosmos. The cosmos, at best, is like a rubbish heap scattered at random, is one of his sayings. He visualized the world not as an edifice, but rather as one colossal process, not as the sum total of all things, but rather as the totality of all events, or changes, or facts. Everything is in flux and nothing is at rest, is the motto of his philosophy. Heraclitus' discovery influenced the development of Greek philosophy for a long time. The philosophies of Parmenides, Democritus, Plato, and Aristotle can all be appropriately described as attempts to solve the problems of that changing world which Heraclitus had discovered. The greatness of this discovery can hardly be overrated. It has been described as a terrifying one, and its effect has been compared with that of an earthquake in which everything seems to sway. I do not doubt that this discovery was impressed upon Heraclitus by terrifying personal experiences suffered as a result of the social and political disturbances of his day. Heraclitus, the first philosopher to deal not only with nature, but even more with ethico-political problems, lived in an age of social revolution. It was in his time that the Greek tribal aristocracies were beginning to yield to the new force of democracy. Social revolution and anti-democratic reaction. In order to understand the effect of this revolution, we must remember the stability and rigidity of social life in a tribal aristocracy. Social life is determined by social and religious taboos. Everybody has his assigned place within the whole of the social structure. Everyone feels that his place is the proper, the natural place assigned to him by the forces which rule the world. Everyone knows his place. According to tradition, Heraclitus' own place was that of heir to the royal family of priest-kings of Ephesus, but he resigned his claims in favor of his brother. In spite of his proud refusal to take part in the political life of his city, He supported the cause of the aristocrats who tried in vain to stem the rising tide of the new revolutionary forces. These experiences in the social or political field are reflected in the remaining fragments of his work. The Ephesians ought to hang themselves man by man, all the adults, and leave the city to be ruled by infants, is one of his outbursts, occasioned by the people's decision to banish Hermodorus, one of Heraclitus's aristocratic friends. His interpretation of the people's motives is most interesting, for it shows that the stock in trade of anti-democratic argument has not changed much since the earliest days of democracy. They said, "Nobody shall be the best among us, and if someone is outstanding, then let him be so elsewhere, and among others." This hostility towards democracy breaks through everywhere in the fragments. But Heraclitus' fight for the ancient laws of his city was in vain, and the transitoriness of all things impressed itself strongly upon him. His theory of change gives expression to this feeling. "Everything is in flux," he said, "and you cannot step twice into the same river." Disillusioned, he argued against the belief that the existing social order would remain forever. We must not act like children reared with a narrow outlook as it has been handed down to us. Historicism's double face, flux and destiny. This emphasis on change, and especially on change in social life, is an important characteristic not only of Heraclitus' philosophy, but of historicism in general. That things, and even kings, change is a truth which needs to be impressed especially upon those who take their social environment for granted. So much is to be admitted. But in the Heraclitean philosophy, one of the less commendable characteristics of historicism manifests itself, namely, an overemphasis upon change, combined with the complementary belief in an inexorable and immutable law of destiny. In this belief, we are confronted with an attitude which, although at first sight contradictory to the historicist's overemphasis upon change, is characteristic of most, if not all, historicists. We can explain this attitude, perhaps, if we interpret the historicist's overemphasis on change as a symptom of an effort needed to overcome his unconscious resistance to the idea of change. It often seems as if they were trying to comfort themselves for the loss of a stable world by clinging to the view that change is ruled by an unchanging law. In the case of Heraclitus, the emphasis upon change leads him to the theory that all material things are like flames, that they are processes rather than things, and that they are all transformations of fire. But having reduced all things to flames, to processes, Heraclitus discerns in the processes a law, a measure, a reason, a wisdom, and having destroyed the cosmos as an edifice and declared it to be a rubbish heap, he reintroduces it as the destined order of events in the world process. Flux and law. Heraclitus discovers universal change, yet comforts himself with an inexorable cosmic law, a pattern Popper finds characteristic of historicism generally. War as creative principle. Strife or war is the dynamic and creative principle of all change, especially of all differences between men. The outcome of war is always just. Every process in the world develops according to a definite law, its measure. It is an inexorable and irresistible law. All events proceed with the necessity of fate. The sun will not outstep the measure of his path, or else the goddesses of fate, the handmaids of justice, will know how to find him. Combined with the historicist idea of a relentless destiny, we frequently find an element of mysticism. Nature loves to hide, he writes, and the Lord whose oracle is at Delphi neither reveals nor conceals, but he indicates his meaning through hints. Mysticism, relativism, and the ethic of fame. Heraclitus' theory of reason takes as its starting point the fact that, if we are awake, we live in a common world. But this theory is given a second, symbolic, mystical meaning, a mystical intuition given to the chosen, to those who are awake. One thing alone is wisdom, to understand the thought which steers everything through everything. From this philosophy springs a theory of the driving force behind all change, a theory which exhibits its historicist character by its emphasis upon the importance of social dynamics as opposed to social statics. Heraclitus declares that strife or war is the dynamic as well as the creative principle of all change, and especially of all differences between men. And being a typical historicist, he accepts the judgment of history as a moral one. For he holds that the outcome of war is always just. War is the father and the king of all things. It proves some to be gods and others to be mere men, turning these into slaves and the former into masters. One must know that war is universal, and that justice, the lawsuit, is strife, and that all things develop through strife and by necessity. But if justice is strife or war, and if history, or more precisely success in war, is the criterion of merit, then the standard of merit must itself be in flux. Heraclitus meets this problem by his relativism and by his doctrine of the identity of opposites. The relativism of values expressed in his fragments does not prevent him from developing upon the background of his theory of the justice of war and the verdict of history a tribalist and romantic ethic of fame, fate, and the superiority of the great man. Who falls fighting will be glorified by gods and by men. The greater the fall, the more glorious the fate. The best seek one thing above all others, eternal fame. One man is worth more than 10,000, if he is great. It is surprising to find in these early fragments, dating from about 500 BC, so much that is characteristic of modern historicist and anti-democratic tendencies. Historicist ideas easily become prominent in times of great social change. They appeared when Greek tribal life broke up, as well as when that of the Jews was shattered by the impact of the Babylonian conquest. There can be little doubt, I believe, that Heraclitus' philosophy is an expression of a feeling of drift, a feeling which seems to be a typical reaction to the dissolution of the ancient tribal forms of social life. In modern Europe, historicist ideas were revived during the Industrial Revolution, and especially through the impact of the political revolutions in American France. It appears to be more than a mere coincidence that Hegel, who adopted so much of Heraclitus' thought and passed it on to all modern historicist movements, was a mouthpiece of the reaction against the French Revolution. Quote, "Everything is in flux and nothing is at rest." Quote, "War is the father and the king of all things. It proves some to be gods and others to be mere men, turning these into slaves and the former into masters." Chapter 3. Plato's Theory of Forms or Ideas. Plato lived in a period of wars and of political strife which was, for all we know, even more unsettled than that which had troubled Heraclitus. While he grew up, the breakdown of the tribal life of the Greeks had led in Athens to a period of tyranny, and later to the establishment of a democracy which tried jealously to guard itself against any attempts to reintroduce either a tyranny or an oligarchy. During his youth, democratic Athens was involved in a deadly war against Sparta. The Peloponnesian War lasted, with an interruption, for 28 years. Plato was born during the war, and he was about 24 when it ended. It brought terrible epidemics, and in its last year, famine, the fall of the city of Athens, civil war, and a rule of terror, usually called the Rule of the 30 Tyrants. These are led by two of Plato's uncles. The re-establishment of the democracy and of peace meant no respite for Plato. His beloved teacher Socrates was tried and executed. Plato himself seems to have been in danger. Together with other companions of Socrates, he left Athens. Later, on the occasion of his first visit to Sicily, Plato became entangled in the political intrigues at the court of the older Dionysius, tyrant of Syracuse. And even after his return to Athens and the foundation of the academy, Plato continued to take an active and ultimately fateful part in the conspiracies and revolutions that constituted Syracusan politics. Historicist impulse and the law of decay. This brief outline may help to explain why we find in Plato, as in Heraclitus, indications that he suffered desperately under the political instability and insecurity of his time. Like Heraclitus, Plato was of royal blood. At least, the tradition claims that his father's family traced its descent from Codrus, the last of the tribal kings of Attica. Plato was very proud of his mother's family which, as he explains in his dialogues, was related to that of Solon, the lawgiver of Athens. His uncles, Critias and Charmides, the leading men of the 30 tyrants, also belonged to his mother's family. With such a family tradition, Plato could be expected to take a deep interest in public affairs, and indeed, most of his works fulfill this expectation. He himself relates that he was from the beginning most anxious for political activity, but that he was deterred by the stirring experiences of his youth. Seeing that everything swayed and shifted aimlessly, I felt giddy and desperate. From the feeling that society, and indeed everything, was in flux arose, I believe, the fundamental impulse of his philosophy, as well as of the philosophy of Heraclitus. And Plato summed up his social experience, exactly as his historicist predecessor had done, by proffering a law of historical development. According to this law, which will be more fully discussed in the next chapter, all social change is corruption or decay or degeneration. This fundamental historical law forms, in Plato's view, part of a cosmic law, of a law which holds for all created or generated things. All things in flux, all generated things, are destined to decay. Plato, like Heraclitus, felt that the forces which are at work in history are cosmic forces. It is nearly certain, however, that Plato believed that this law of degeneration was not the whole story. We have found, in Heraclitus, a tendency to visualize the laws of development as cyclic laws. Similarly, we can find, in some of Plato's works, the suggestion of a great year. Its length appears to be 36,000 ordinary years, with a period of improvement or generation, presumably corresponding to spring and summer, and one of degeneration and decay, corresponding to autumn and winter. According to the statesman, a golden age, the age of Kronos, is followed by our own age, the age of Zeus, an age in which the world is abandoned by the gods and left to its own resources, and which consequently is one of increasing corruption. Moral will against destiny. Great as the similarities are between Plato and Heraclitus, we have struck here an important difference. Plato believed that the law of historical destiny, the law of decay, can be broken by the moral will of man, supported by the power of human reason. Plato believed that the law of degeneration involved moral degeneration. Political degeneration, at any rate, depends, in his view, mainly upon moral degeneration and lack of knowledge. And moral degeneration, in its turn, is due mainly to racial degeneration. The great cosmic turning point may coincide with a turning point in the field of human affairs, the moral and intellectual field, and may therefore appear to us to be brought about by a moral and intellectual human effort. Plato may well have believed that, just as the general law of decay did manifest itself in moral decay leading to political decay, so the advent of the cosmic turning point would manifest itself in the coming of a great lawgiver whose powers of reasoning and whose moral will are capable of bringing this period of political decay to a close. However this may be, he certainly believed in both, in a general historical tendency towards corruption, and in the possibility that we may stop further corruption in the political field by arresting all political change. This, accordingly, is the aim he strives for. He tries to realize it by the establishment of a state which is free from the evils of all other states because it does not degenerate, because it does not change. The state which is free from the evil of change and corruption is the best, the perfect state. It is the state of the golden age which knew no change. It is the arrested state. Historicism versus social engineering. In believing in such an ideal state, which does not change, Plato deviates radically from the tenets of historicism which we found in Heraclitus. But important as this difference is, it gives rise to further points of similarity between Plato and Heraclitus. Heraclitus, despite the boldness of his reasoning, seems to have shrunk from the idea of replacing the cosmos by chaos. He seems to have comforted himself for the loss of a stable world by clinging to the view that change is ruled by an unchanging law. This tendency to shrink back from the last consequences of historicism is characteristic of many historicists. In Plato, this tendency becomes paramount. Heraclitus had generalized his experience of social flux by extending it to the world of all things, and Plato did the same. But Plato also extended his belief in a perfect state that does not change to the realm of all things. He believed that to every kind of ordinary or decaying thing there corresponds also a perfect thing that does not decay. This belief in perfect and unchanging things, usually called the theory of forms or ideas, became the central doctrine of his philosophy. Plato's belief that it is possible for us to break the iron law of destiny and to avoid decay by arresting all change shows that his historicist tendencies had definite limitations. An uncompromising historicism would hesitate to admit that man, by any effort, can alter the laws of historical destiny even after he has discovered them. In order to gain a better understanding of this out-and-out historicist attitude, and to analyze the opposite tendency inherent in Plato's belief that he could influence fate, Popper contrasts historicism with a diametrically opposite approach, which may be called the attitude of social engineering. The social engineer does not ask any questions about historical tendencies or the destiny of man. He believes that man is the master of his own destiny and that, in accordance with our aims, we can influence or change the history of man, just as we have changed the face of the earth. He does not believe that these ends are imposed upon us by our historical background or by the trends of history, but rather that they are chosen or even created by ourselves, as opposed to the historicist who believes that intelligent political action is possible only if the future course of history is first determined. The social engineer believes that a scientific basis of politics would consist of the factual information necessary for the construction or alteration of social institutions, in accordance with our wishes and aims, something like a social technology, as opposed to the historicist who understands it as a science of immutable historical tendencies. Piecemeal social engineering. The construction or alteration of social institutions in accordance with our wishes and aims, using factual information rather than historical prophecy, contrasted with utopian social engineering in Chapter 9. Historicism. The view that intelligent political action requires first determining the future course of history through laws of development. From what Popper has said about the attitude of the social engineer, it must not be inferred that there are no important differences within the camp of the social engineers. The difference between piecemeal social engineering and utopian social engineering is one of the main themes of the book. But for the time being, Popper is concerned only with the opposition between historicism and social engineering. The historicist is inclined to look upon social institutions mainly from the point of view of their history, their origin, development, and present and future significance. The social engineer and technologist, on the other hand, will hardly take much interest in the origin of institutions. Rather, he will put his problem like this: if such and such are our aims, is this institution well designed and organized to serve them? The two attitudes, historicism and social engineering, occur sometimes in typical combinations. The earliest and probably the most influential example is the social and political philosophy of Plato. It combines, as it were, some fairly obvious technological elements in the foreground, with a background dominated by an elaborate display of typically historicist features. All utopian systems recommend some kind of social engineering, since they demand the adoption of certain institutional means for the achievement of their ends. But when we proceed to a consideration of these ends, then we frequently find that they are determined by historicism. Plato's political ends depend to a considerable extent on his historicist doctrines. First, it is his aim to escape the Heraclitean flux manifested in social revolution and historical decay. Secondly, he believes that this can be done by establishing a state which is so perfect that it does not participate in the general trend of historical development. Thirdly, he believes that the model or original of his perfect state can be found in the distant past, in a golden age which existed in the dawn of history. The forms as primogenitors, the things in flux, the degenerate and decaying things, are the offspring, the children, as it were, of perfect things. And like children, they are copies of their original primogenitors. The father or original of the thing in flux is what Plato calls its form, or its pattern, or its idea. The form or idea, in spite of its name, is no idea in our mind. It is not a phantasm nor a dream, but a real thing. It is indeed more real than all the ordinary things which are in flux, and which, in spite of their apparent solidity, are doomed to decay. For the form or idea is a thing that is perfect and does not perish. The forms or ideas must not be thought to dwell, like perishable things, in space and time. They are outside space and also outside time, because they are eternal. But they are in contact with space and time, for since they are the primogenitors or models of the things which are generated and which develop and decay in space and time, they must have been in contact with space at the beginning of time. Since they are not with us in our space and time, they cannot be perceived by our senses, as can the ordinary changing things which interact with our senses and are therefore called sensible things. Those sensible things, which are copies or children of the same model or original, resemble not only this original, their form or idea, but also one another, as do children of the same family. As a child may look upon his father, seeing in him an ideal, a unique model, a godlike personification of his own aspiration, the embodiment of perfection, of wisdom, of stability, glory, and virtue, so Plato looks upon the forms or ideas. The Platonic idea is the original and the origin of the thing. It is the rationale of the thing, the reason of its existence, the stable, sustaining principle in virtue of which it exists. It is the virtue of the thing, its ideal, its perfection. Father, mother, and the religious analogy. The comparison between the form or idea of a class of sensible things and the father of a family of children is developed by Plato in the Timaeus. He describes the abstract space in which the sensible things move as a receptacle and compares it with the mother of things, in which at the beginning of time the sensible things are created by the forms which stamp or impress themselves upon pure space, and thereby give the offspring their shape. We must conceive, writes Plato, three kinds of things. First, those which undergo generation. Secondly, that in which generation takes place. And thirdly, the model in whose likeness the generated things are born. And we may compare the receiving principle to a mother and the model to a father and their product to a child. It may contribute to the understanding of Plato's theory of forms or ideas if we compare it with certain Greek religious beliefs. Some at least of the Greek gods are nothing but idealized tribal primogenitors and heroes, personifications of the virtue or perfection of the tribe. These gods are immortal or eternal, and perfect, or very nearly so, while ordinary men are involved in the flux of all things and subject to decay. There is an important difference between Greek mythology and Plato's theory of forms or ideas. While the Greeks venerated many gods as the ancestors of various tribes or families, the theory of ideas demands that there should be only one form or idea of man. For it is one of the central doctrines that there is only one form of every race or kind of things. The uniqueness of the form is a necessary element of the theory if it is to perform one of its most important functions, namely, to explain the similarity of sensible things by proposing that the similar things are copies or imprints of one form. From flux to knowledge, Socrates and Aristotle. If all things are in continuous flux, then it is impossible to say anything definite about them. We can have no real knowledge of them, but at the best, vague and delusive opinions. This point worried many followers of Heraclitus. Parmenides had taught that the pure knowledge of reason, as opposed to the delusive opinion of experience, could have as its object only a world which did not change. But the unchanging and undivided reality which Parmenides thought he had discovered behind the world of perishable things was entirely unrelated to this world in which we live and die. It was therefore incapable of explaining it. With this, Plato could not be satisfied. Much as he disliked and despised this empirical world of flux, he was, at bottom, most deeply interested in it. He wanted to unveil the secret of its decay, of its violent changes, and of its unhappiness. He hoped to discover the means of its salvation. He was deeply impressed by Parmenides' doctrine of an unchanging, real, solid, and perfect world behind this ghostly world in which he suffered. But this conception did not solve his problems as long as it remained unrelated to the world of sensible things. What he was looking for was knowledge, not opinion, the pure rational knowledge of a world that does not change, but at the same time, knowledge that could be used to investigate this changing world, and especially this changing society, political change with its strange historical laws. Plato aimed at discovering the secret of the royal knowledge of politics, of the art of ruling men. But an exact science of politics seemed as impossible as any exact knowledge of a world in flux. There were no fixed objects in the political field. How could one discuss any political questions when the meaning of words like government or state or city changed with every new phase in the historical development? In this situation, Plato obtained, as Aristotle tells us, a most important hint from Socrates. Socrates was interested in ethical matters. He was an ethical reformer who pestered all kinds of people, forcing them to think, to explain, and to account for the principles of their actions. The typical reply, that we act in a certain way because it is wise or efficient or just or pious, only incited him to continue his questions by asking what is wisdom or efficiency or justice or piety. In other words, he was led to inquire into the virtue of a thing. It was natural, says Aristotle, that Socrates should search for the essence, i.e., for the virtue or rationale of a thing, and for the real, the unchanging or essential meanings of the terms. In this connection, he became the first to raise the problem of universal definitions. Plato retained the Heraclitean doctrines that all sensible things are ever in a state of flux, and that there is no knowledge about them. But he found in Socrates' method a way out of these difficulties. Though there could be no definition of any sensible thing, as they were always changing, there could be definitions and true knowledge of things of a different kind, of the virtues of the sensible things. If knowledge or thought were to have an object, there would have to be some different, some unchanging entities, apart from those which are sensible, says Aristotle, and he reports of Plato that things of this other sort, then he called forms or ideas. 3 functions and methodological essentialism. According to Popper's analysis, the theory of forms or ideas has at least 3 different functions in Plato's philosophy. 1. It is a most important methodological device, for it makes possible pure scientific knowledge, and even knowledge which could be applied to the world of changing things of which we cannot immediately obtain any knowledge, but only opinion. Thus it becomes possible to inquire into the problems of a changing society and to build up a political science. 2. It provides the clue to the urgently needed theory of change and of decay, to a theory of generation and degeneration, and especially the clue to history. 3. It opens a way, in the social realm, towards some kind of social engineering. It makes possible the forging of instruments for arresting social change, since it suggests designing a best state, which so closely resembles the form or idea of a state that it cannot decay. Popper uses the name methodological essentialism to characterize the view, held by Plato and many of his followers, that it is the task of pure knowledge or science to discover and to describe the true nature of things, i.e., their hidden reality or essence. Many of the later methodological essentialists, for instance Aristotle, did not altogether follow Plato in locating essences and forms, but they all agreed with him in determining the task of pure knowledge as the discovery of the hidden nature or form or essence of things. All these methodological essentialists also agreed with Plato in holding that these essences may be discovered and discerned with the help of intellectual intuition, that every essence has a name proper to it, and that it may be described in words. In a description of the essence of a thing they all called a definition. Methodological essentialism can be better understood when contrasted with its opposite, methodological nominalism. Instead of aiming at finding out what a thing really is and at defining its true nature, methodological nominalism aims at describing how a thing behaves in various circumstances, and especially whether there are any regularities in its behavior. In other words, methodological nominalism sees the aim of science in the description of the things and events of our experience, and in an explanation of these events, i.e., their description with the help of universal laws. Methodological nominalism is nowadays fairly generally accepted in the natural sciences. The problems of the social sciences, on the other hand, are still for the most part treated by essentialist methods. This is, in Popper's opinion, one of the main reasons for their backwardness. The arguments usually offered in support of the essentialist view in social science emphasize the importance of change in society and exhibit other aspects of historicism. The social scientist, so runs a typical argument, is in a very different position from the physicist. His whole field of interest is changing. There are no permanent entities in the social realm, where everything is under the sway of historical flux. How, for instance, can we study government? How can we identify it in the diversity of governmental institutions found in different states at different historical periods, without assuming that they have something essentially in common? These modern arguments are, Popper thinks, very similar to those reported by Aristotle, which led Plato to his doctrine of forms or ideas. Before proceeding to Plato's sociology, Popper makes it quite clear that he is confining his treatment of Plato to his historicism and to his best state. His attitude towards historicism is one of frank hostility, based upon the conviction that historicism is futile and worse than that. Although he admires much in Plato's philosophy, he is bent on destroying what is, in his opinion, mischievous in this philosophy. It is the totalitarian tendency of Plato's political philosophy which he shall try to analyze and to criticize. Quote, "Seeing that everything swayed and shifted aimlessly, I felt giddy and desperate." Quote, "We must conceive three kinds of things. First, those which undergo generation. Secondly, that in which generation takes place. And thirdly, the model in whose likeness the generated things are born. And we may compare the receiving principle to a mother and the model to a father and their product to a child." Quote, "The state which is free from the evil of change and corruption is the best, the perfect state. It is the state of the golden age, which knew no change. It is the arrested state." Chapter 4. Change and Rest. Plato was one of the first social scientists and undoubtedly by far the most influential. In the sense in which the term sociology was understood by Kant, Mill, and Spencer, he was a sociologist. That is to say, he successfully applied his idealist method to an analysis of the social life of man and of the laws of its development, as well as the laws and conditions of its stability. In spite of Plato's great influence, this side of his teaching has been little noticed. This seems to be due to two factors. First of all, much of Plato's sociology is presented by him in such close connection with his ethical and political demands that the descriptive elements have been largely overlooked. Secondly, many of his thoughts were taken so much for granted that they were simply absorbed unconsciously and therefore uncritically. It is mainly in this way that his sociological theories became so influential. Plato's sociology is an ingenious blend of speculation with acute observation of facts. Its speculative setting is, of course, the theory of forms and of universal flux and decay, of generation and degeneration. But on this idealist foundation, Plato constructs an astonishingly realistic theory of society, capable of explaining the main trends in the historical development of the Greek city-states, as well as the social and political forces at work in his own day. The metaphysics of decay. The speculative or metaphysical setting of Plato's theory of social change has already been sketched. It is the world of unchanging forms or ideas, of which the world of changing things in space and time is the offspring. The forms or ideas are not only unchanging, indestructible, and incorruptible, but also perfect, true, real, and good. In fact, good is once, in the Republic, explained as everything that preserves, and evil as everything that destroys or corrupts. The perfect and good forms or ideas are prior to the copies, the sensible things, and they're something like primogenitors or starting points of all the changes in the world of flux. This view is used for evaluating the general trend and main direction of all changes in the world of sensible things. For if the starting point of all change is perfect and good, then change can only be a movement that leads away from the perfect and good. It must be directed towards the imperfect and the evil, towards corruption. The more closely a sensible thing resembles its form or idea, the less corruptible it must be, since the forms themselves are incorruptible. But sensible or generated things are not perfect copies. Indeed, no copy can be perfect, since it is only an imitation of the true reality, only appearance and illusion, not the truth. Accordingly, no sensible things resemble their forms sufficiently closely to be unchangeable. Every change, however small, must make it different, and thus less perfect, by reducing its resemblance to its form. In this way, the thing becomes more changeable with every change, and more corruptible, since it becomes further removed from its form, which is its cause of immobility and of being at rest. This process of degeneration, slow at first and more rapid afterwards, this law of decline and fall, is dramatically described by Plato in the Laws. All things that share in soul change, he writes, and while they change, they are carried along by the order and law of destiny. The smaller the change in their character, the less significant is the beginning decline in their level of rank. But when the change increases, and with it the iniquity, then they fall down into the abyss and what is known as the infernal regions. Earlier in the Laws, Plato summarizes his doctrine of change. Any change whatever, except the change of an evil thing, is the gravest of all the treacherous dangers that can befall a thing. In brief, Plato teaches that change is evil, and that rest is divine. We see now that Plato's theory of forms or ideas implies a certain trend in the development of the world in flux. It leads to the law that the corruptibility of all things in that world must continually increase. It is not so much a rigid law of universally increasing corruption, but rather a law of increasing corruptibility. That is to say, the danger or the likelihood of corruption increases, but exceptional developments in the other direction are not excluded. Thus, it is possible that a very good soul may defy change and decay, and that a very evil thing, for instance, a very evil city, may be improved by changing it. In full accordance with this general theory is Plato's story, in the Timaeus, of the origin of species. According to this story, man, the highest of animals, is generated by the gods. The other species originate from him by a process of corruption and degeneration. First, certain men, the cowards and villains, degenerate into women. Those who are lacking wisdom degenerate step by step into the lower animals. Birds came into being through the transformation of harmless but too easygoing people. Land animals came from men who had no interest in philosophy. And fishes, including shellfish, degenerated from the most foolish, stupid, and unworthy of all men. From metaphysics to descriptive sociology, it is clear that this theory can be applied to human society and to its history. It then explains Hesiod's pessimistic law of development, the law of historical decay. If we are to believe Aristotle's report, then the theory of forms or ideas was originally introduced in order to meet a methodological demand, the demand for pure or rational knowledge, which is impossible in the case of sensible things in flux. We now see that the theory does more than that. Over and above meeting these methodological demands, it provides a theory of change. It explains the general direction of the flux of all sensible things, and thereby the historical tendency to degenerate shown by man and human society. If, as Popper believes, the philosophies of Plato as well as Heraclitus sprang from their social experience, especially from the experience of class war and from the abject feeling that their social world was going to pieces, then we can understand why the theory of forms came to play such an important part in Plato's philosophy when he found that it was capable of explaining the trend towards degeneration. He must have welcomed it as the solution of a most mystifying riddle. While Heraclitus had been unable to pass a direct ethical condemnation upon the trend of the political development, Plato found, in his theory of forms, the theoretical basis for a pessimistic judgment in Hesiod's vein. But Plato's greatness as a sociologist does not lie in his general and abstract speculations about the law of social decay. It lies rather in the wealth and detail of his observations, and in the amazing acuteness of his sociological intuition. He saw things which had not been seen before him, and which were rediscovered only in our own time. As an example, Popper may mention his theory of the primitive beginnings of society, of tribal patriarchy, and his attempt to outline the typical periods in the development of social life. Another example is Plato's sociological and economic historicism, his emphasis upon the economic background of the political life and the historical development, a theory revived by Marx under the name historical materialism. A third example is Plato's most interesting law of political revolutions, according to which all revolutions presuppose a disunited ruling class, a law which forms the basis of his analysis of the means of arresting political change and creating a social equilibrium, and which has been recently rediscovered by the theoreticians of totalitarianism, especially by Plato. The law of political revolution. The dialogues in which Plato discusses these questions are, in chronological order, the Republic, the Statesman, and the Laws. In spite of certain minor differences, there is much agreement between these dialogues. The Laws present the story of the decline and fall of human society as an account of Greek prehistory merging without any break into history, while the parallel passages of the Republic give, in a more abstract way, a systematic outline of the development of government. The Statesman gives a logical classification of types of government, with only a few allusions to historical events. One of the main objects of Plato's analysis of political developments is to ascertain the driving force of all historical change. In the Laws, the historical survey is explicitly undertaken with this aim in view. Have not uncounted thousands of cities been born during this time, and has not each of them been under all kinds of government? Let us, if we can, get hold of the cause of so much change. I hope that we may thus reveal the secret both of the birth of constitutions and also of their changes. As the result of these investigations, he discovers the sociological law that internal disunion, class war fomented by the antagonism of economic class interests, is the driving force of all political revolutions. But Plato's formulation of this fundamental law goes even further. He insists that only internal sedition within the ruling class itself can weaken it so much that its rule can be overthrown. Changes in any constitution originate, without exception, within the ruling class itself, and only when this class becomes the seat of disunion, is his formula in the Republic. This sociological law, together with the observation that economic interests are the most likely causes of disunion, is Plato's clue to history. But it is more. It is also the clue to his analysis of the conditions necessary for the establishment of political equilibrium, i.e., for arresting political change. He assumes that these conditions were realized in the best or perfect state of ancient times. The four stages of political degeneration. According to the Republic, the original or primitive form of society, and at the same time the one that resembles the form or idea of a state most closely, the best state, is a kingship of the wisest and most godlike of men. This ideal city-state is so near perfection that it is hard to understand how it can ever change. Still, a change does take place, and with it enters Heraclitus' strife, the driving force of all movement. According to Plato, internal strife, class war, fomented by self-interest, and especially material or economic self-interest, is the main force of social dynamics. The Marxian formula, the history of all hitherto existing societies is a history of class struggle, fits Plato's historicism nearly as well as that of Marx. The four most conspicuous periods or landmarks in the history of political degeneration, and at the same time, the most important varieties of existing states, are described by Plato in the following order. First, after the perfect state, comes timarchy or timocracy, the rule of the noble who seek honor and fame, Secondly, oligarchy, the rule of the rich families. Next in order, democracy is born, the rule of liberty, which means lawlessness. And last comes tyranny, the fourth and final sickness of the city. As can be seen from the last remark, Plato looks upon history, which to him is a history of social decay, as if it were the history of an illness. The patient is society, and, as we shall see later, the statesman ought to be a physician, a healer, a savior. Timocracy and oligarchy. The first form into which the perfect state degenerates, timocracy, the rule of the ambitious nobleman, is said to be in nearly all respects similar to the perfect state itself. Plato explicitly identified this best and oldest among the existing states with the Dorian constitution of Sparta and Crete. Through his doctrine of the similarity between Sparta and the perfect state, Plato became one of the most successful propagators of what Popper calls the great myth of Sparta, the perennial and influential myth of the supremacy of the Spartan constitution and way of life. The main difference between the best or ideal state and timocracy is that the latter contains an element of instability. The once united patriarchal ruling class is now disunited, and it is this disunity which leads to the next step to its degeneration into oligarchy. Disunion is brought about by ambition. First, says Plato, speaking of the young Timocrat, he hears his mother complaining that her husband is not one of the rulers. Thus he becomes ambitious and longs for distinction. But decisive in bringing about the next change are competitive and acquisitive social tendencies. We must describe, says Plato, how timocracy changes into oligarchy. Even a blind man must see how it changes. It is the treasure house that ruins this constitution. In this way arises the first-class conflict, that between virtue and money, or between the old established ways of feudal simplicity and the new ways of wealth. The transition to oligarchy is completed when the rich establish a law that disqualifies from public office all those whose means do not reach the stipulated amount. With the establishment of the oligarchy, a state of potential civil war between the oligarchs and the poorer classes is reached. This civil war begets democracy. Democracy is born when the poor win the day, killing some, banishing others, and sharing with the rest the rights of citizenship and of public offices on terms of equality. Democracy and tyranny. Plato's description of democracy is a vivid but intensely hostile and unjust parody of the political life of Athens and of the democratic creed which Pericles had formulated in a manner which has never been surpassed, about 3 years before Plato was born. Plato's description is a brilliant piece of political propaganda, and we can appreciate what harm it must have done if we consider that a man like Adam, an excellent scholar and editor of the Republic, is unable to resist the rhetoric of Plato's denunciation of his native city. It seems that often when Plato's style becomes a full tide of lofty thoughts and images and words, he is in urgent need of a cloak to cover up the rags and tatters of his argumentation, or even the complete absence of rational arguments. In their stead, he uses invective, identifying liberty with lawlessness, freedom with license, and equality before the law with disorder. Democrats are described as profligate and niggardly, as insolent, lawless, and shameless, as fierce, and as terrible beasts of prey. Here, after all, Plato pays homage to his native city, even though he does it unwittingly. It will forever remain one of the greatest triumphs of Athenian democracy that it treated slaves humanely, and that in spite of the inhuman propaganda of philosophers like Plato himself and Aristotle came, as he witnesses, very close to abolishing slavery. Of much greater merit, although it too is inspired by hatred, is Plato's description of tyranny and especially of the transition to it. He insists that he describes things which he has seen himself. No doubt, the allusion is to his experiences at the court of the older Dionysius, tyrant of Syracuse. The transition from democracy to tyranny, Plato says, is most easily brought about by a popular leader who knows how to exploit the class antagonism between the rich and the poor within the democratic state, and who succeeds in building up a bodyguard or a private army of his own. The people who have hailed him first as the champion of freedom are soon enslaved, and then they must fight for him in one war after another which he must stir up, because he must make the people feel the need of a general. With tyranny, the most abject state is reached. The perfect state as arrested history. Plato's description of the perfect or best state has usually been interpreted as the utopian program of a progressivist. In spite of his repeated assertions that he is describing the distant past, it is often assumed that it was his intention to give a veiled description of the future. But Popper thinks that Plato meant what he said, and that many characteristics of his best state are intended to be historical, or perhaps prehistorical. Plato arrived at his picture by an idealized description of the ancient tribal aristocracies of Crete and Sparta. With his acute sociological intuition, he had seen that these forms were not only old, but petrified, arrested, that they were relics of a still older form. And he concluded that this still older form had been even more stable, more securely arrested. How does Plato solve the problem of avoiding class war? Had he been a progressivist, he might have hit on the idea of a classless, egalitarian society. But he was not out to construct a state that might come, but a state that had been the father of the Spartan state. It was a slave state, and, accordingly, Plato's best state is based on the most rigid class distinctions. It is a caste state. The problem of avoiding class war is solved, not by abolishing classes, but by giving the ruling class a superiority which cannot be challenged. As in Sparta, the ruling class alone is permitted to carry arms, it alone has any political or other rights, and it alone receives education. As long as the ruling class is united, there can be no challenge to their authority, and, consequently, no class war. Plato distinguishes three classes in his best state: the guardians, their armed auxiliaries or warriors, and the working class. But actually, there are only two castes: the military caste, the armed and educated rulers, and the unarmed and uneducated ruled, the human sheep. The workers, tradesmen, etc., do not interest him at all. They're only human cattle whose sole function is to provide for the material needs of the ruling class. Plato even goes so far as to forbid his rulers to legislate for people of this class and for their petty problems: communism, breeding, and education. Since the ruling class alone has political power, the whole problem of preserving the state is reduced to that of preserving the internal unity of the master class. How is this unity of the rulers preserved? By training and other psychological influences, but otherwise mainly by the elimination of economic interests which may lead to disunion. This economic abstinence is achieved and controlled by the introduction of communism, i.e., by the abolition of private property, especially of precious metals. This communism is confined to the ruling class, which alone must be kept free from disunion. Since all property is common property, there must also be a common ownership of women and children. No member of the ruling class must be able to identify his children or his parents. The family must be destroyed, or rather, extended to cover the whole warrior class. Family loyalties might otherwise become a possible source of disunion. But even the common ownership of women and children is not quite sufficient to guard the ruling class from all economic dangers. It is important to avoid prosperity as well as poverty. Both are dangers to unity. Poverty, because it drives people to adopt desperate means to satisfy their needs. Prosperity, because most change arises from abundance, from accumulation of wealth, which makes dangerous experiments possible. Only a communist system, which has room neither for great want nor for great wealth, can reduce economic interests to a minimum and guarantee the unity of the ruling class. The communism of the ruling caste can thus be derived from Plato's fundamental sociological law of change. It is a necessary condition of the political stability which is its fundamental characteristic. But although an important condition, it is not a sufficient one. In order that the ruling class may feel really united, that it should feel like one tribe, i.e., like one big family, pressure from without the class is as necessary as are the ties between the members of the class. This pressure can be secured by emphasizing and widening the gulf between the rulers and the ruled. Any meddling or changing over from one class to another, says Plato, is a great crime against the city and may rightly be denounced as the basest wickedness. Law of political revolution. Changes in any constitution originate, without exception, within the ruling class itself, and only when this class becomes the seat of disunion. Arrested state. The best state does not participate in historical development. It is the golden age made permanent. Change is evil. Rest is divine. Origin, breeding, and the shepherd metaphor. Regarding the origin of the ruling class, Plato speaks in The Statesman of a time, prior even to that of his best state, when God himself was the shepherd of men, ruling over them exactly as man still rules over the beasts. In the laws we are told that this primitive society is one of nomad hill shepherds under a patriarch. Government originated as the rule of the eldest who inherited his authority from his father or mother. All the others followed him like a flock of birds. These nomad tribes settled in the cities of the Peloponnese, especially in Sparta, under the name of Dorians. In a parallel passage in the Republic, Plato gives us a mythological yet very pointed description of the conquest itself, when dealing with the origin of the Earthborn, the ruling class of the best city. After having armed and trained the Earthborn, let us now make them advance under the command of the guardians till they arrive in the city. Then let them look round to find out the best place for their camp, the spot that is most suitable for keeping down the inhabitants, should anyone show unwillingness to obey the law, and for holding back external enemies who may come down like wolves on the fold. This short but triumphant tale of the subjugation of a sedentary population by a conquering war horde must be kept in mind when we interpret Plato's reiterated insistence that good rulers, whether gods or demigods or guardians, are patriarchal shepherds of men, and that the true political art, the art of ruling, is a kind of herdsmanship, i.e. the art of managing and keeping down the human cattle. The breeding and the education of the auxiliaries and thereby of the ruling class is, like their carrying of arms, a class symbol and therefore a class prerogative. The race of the guardians must be kept pure, says Plato in defense of infanticide, when developing the racialist argument that we breed animals with great care while neglecting our own race. He demands that the same principles be applied to the breeding of the master race as are applied, by an experienced breeder, to dogs, horses, or birds. The racial qualities demanded from a guardian or from an auxiliary are, more specifically, those of a sheepdog. In his enthusiasm and admiration for the dog, Plato goes so far as to discern in him a genuine philosophical nature, for is not the love of learning identical with the philosophical attitude? The main difficulty which besets Plato is that guardians and auxiliaries must be endowed with a character that is fierce and gentle at the same time. It is clear that they must be bred to be fierce, since they must meet any danger in a fearless and unconquerable spirit. Yet if their nature is to be like that, how are they to be kept from being violent against one another or against the rest of the citizens? Plato finds this a very serious problem until he remembers the dog again. Well-bred dogs are by nature most gentle to their friends and acquaintances, but the very opposite to strangers, he says. It is therefore proved that the character we try to give our guardians is not contrary to nature. Education as political weapon. Plato's educational aim is exactly the same. The purely political aim of stabilizing the state by blending a fierce and a gentle element in the character of the rulers. The two disciplines in which children of the Greek upper class were educated, gymnastics and music, are correlated by Plato with the two elements of character, fierceness and gentleness. Have you not observed, asks Plato, how the character is affected by an exclusive training in gymnastics without music, and how it is affected by the opposite training? Exclusive preoccupation with gymnastics produces men who are fiercer than they ought to be, while an analogous preoccupation with music makes them too soft. But we maintain that our guardians must combine both of these natures. This is why I say that some god must have given man these two arts, music and gymnastics, and their purpose is not so much to serve soul and body respectively, but rather to tune properly the two main strings, i.e., to bring into harmony the two elements of the soul, gentleness and fierceness. In spite of the fact that Plato identifies the gentle element of the soul with her philosophic disposition, he is not at all biased in favor of the gentle element. The impartiality in balancing the two elements leads him to impose the most severe restrictions on literary education, compared with what was, in his time, customary in Athens. Plato's political principles of literary education are based upon a simple comparison. Sparta treated its human cattle just a little too harshly. Athens was altogether too liberal and slack in her treatment of slaves. Plato took this as proof that Sparta insisted just a little too much on gymnastics, and Athens far too much on music. This simple estimate enabled him readily to reconstruct what, in his opinion, must have been the true measure or the true blend of the two elements in the education of the best state. The political principle that determines the education of the soul determines also that of the body. While the Athenian citizen was educated to a general versatility, Plato demands that the ruling class shall be trained as a class of professional warriors, ready to strike against enemies from without or from within the state. Children of both sexes, we are told twice, must be taken on horseback within the sight of actual war, and provided it can be done safely, they must be brought into battle and made to taste blood, just as one does with young hounds. The description of a modern writer who characterizes contemporary totalitarian education as an intensified and continual form of mobilization fits Plato's whole system of education very well indeed. Summary. In an attempt to understand and to interpret the changing social world as he experienced it, Plato was led to develop a systematic historicist sociology in great detail. He thought of existing states as decaying copies of an unchanging form or idea. He tried to reconstruct this form or idea of a state, or at least to describe a society which resembled it as closely as possible. Along with ancient traditions, he used as material for his reconstruction the results of his analysis of the social institutions of Sparta and Crete, the most ancient forms of social life he could find in Greece, in which he recognized arrested forms of even older tribal societies. But in order to make a proper use of this material, he needed a principle for distinguishing between the good or original or ancient traits of the existing institutions and their symptoms of decay. This principle he found in his law of political revolutions, according to which disunion in the ruling class and their preoccupation with economic affairs are the origin of all social change. His best state was therefore to be reconstructed in such a way as to eliminate all the germs and elements of disunion and decay as radically as this could be done. Interpreting existing societies as decadent copies of an ideal state, Plato furnished Hesiod's somewhat crude views of human history at once with a theoretical background and with a wealth of practical application. He developed a remarkably realistic historicist theory which found the cause of social change in Heraclitus' disunion, and in the strife of classes in which he recognized the driving as well as the corrupting forces of history. He applied these historicist principles to the story of the decline and fall of the Greek city-states, and especially to a criticism of democracy, which he described as effeminate and degenerate. Later in the Laws, he applied them also to a story of the decline and fall of the Persian Empire, thus making the beginning of a long series of decline and fall dramatizations of the histories of empires and civilizations. All this, Popper thinks, can be interpreted as an attempt, and a most impressive one, to explain and to rationalize his experience of the breakdown of the tribal society, an experience analogous to that which had led Heraclitus to develop the first philosophy of change. Quote, "Any change whatever, except the change of an evil thing, is the gravest of all the treacherous dangers that can befall a thing." Quote, "Changes in any constitution originate, without exception, within the ruling class itself, and only when this class becomes the seat of disunion." Quote, "Democracy is born when the poor win the day, killing some, banishing others, and sharing with the rest the rights of citizenship and of public offices on terms of equality." Chapter 5. Nature and Convention. Plato was not the first to approach social phenomena in the spirit of scientific investigation, The beginning belongs, at least, to the generation of Protagoras and the Sophists. What matters for understanding Plato's sociology, it seems to me, is the hard-won distinction between man's natural environment and his social environment, a distinction still imperfectly grasped in our own day, when many of us continue to treat the peculiarities of our social world as if they were simply natural. In the magical attitude of a primitive tribal or closed society, taboos and customs are felt to be as inevitable as the seasons. Only after that closed world breaks down can a theoretical understanding of nature and society develop. This chapter traces that development and shows how Plato's naturalism exploits, rather than completes, natural laws and normative laws. I believe that a fundamental distinction must be kept clear if we are to read Plato fairly, between a. Natural laws, descriptive regularities such as the law of gravity or the succession of seasons, and b. Normative laws, norms, prohibitions, and commandments, such as the Ten Commandments or the rules governing parliamentary elections. A law in sense, a. describes a strict regularity that either holds in nature or does not. If we are uncertain, we call a hypothesis. A supposed law of nature is not broken when an exception appears. The hypothesis is refuted. Natural laws are unalterable. They cannot be enforced or violated, though ignorance of them may bring us to grief. Normative laws in sense, b, are altogether different. They can be enforced by men, they are alterable, and they direct conduct rather than describe facts. A significant norm can be broken. One that cannot be broken is without significance. Natural law, since a true or false statement of unvarying regularity in nature, refutation, not exception, when it fails. Normative law, since be a rule forbidding or commanding conduct, enforceable, alterable, and significant only because it can be disobeyed. Many thinkers nevertheless insist that some norms are natural in the sense that they accord with psychological or biological laws, or that natural laws are themselves divine decrees. These views may deserve discussion, but discussion is impossible if we blur the terminology. I shall reserve natural laws for laws of type, A, and speak of natural rights or natural norms when we wish to stress the claimed natural character of type, B. Quote, since laws of nature are unalterable, they can be neither broken nor enforced. They are beyond human control, although they may possibly be used by us for technical purposes, and although we may get into trouble by not knowing them or by ignoring them. From naive monism to critical dualism. For understanding Plato, I believe we must see how the distinction between natural and normative law may have developed. The starting point is what I call naive monism, characteristic of the closed society, in which unpleasant experiences, whether from nature or from sanctions imposed by men when taboos are broken, are not yet distinguished. Within this stage, naive conventionalism is more important than abstract, naive naturalism. Both natural and normative regularities are experienced as dependent on the decisions of man-like gods. Heraclitus' saying about the sun and the handmaids of justice illustrates how even natural regularities may be thought upheld by sanctions, as if they were normative. The breakdown of magical tribalism is connected with the realization that taboos differ between tribes, are imposed and enforced by men, and may be escaped if one evades human sanctions, that laws are altered and made by lawgivers, from Solon to the common people of democratic cities. These experiences may lead to critical dualism or critical conventionalism, characteristic of the open society. The conviction that norms are man-made in the sense that we can judge and alter them and bear full responsibility for adopting them, even though we do not create them consciously from nothing. Naive monism, no distinction yet between natural regularities and normative taboos. Sanctions and natural misfortune are of a piece. Critical dualism, norms are our decisions, imposed upon facts. Nature consists of facts and regularities, neither moral nor immoral in itself. Quote, nature consists of facts and of regularities, and is in itself neither moral nor immoral. It is we who impose our standards upon nature, and who in this way introduce morals into the natural world, in spite of the fact that we are part of this world. Decisions cannot be derived from facts. Critical dualism insists that decisions can never be derived from facts, although they pertain to facts. The decision to oppose slavery does not depend upon the fact that all men are born free. Even if all were born free, some might put others in chains and conversely. For any alterable fact, disease, inequality, poverty, we may decide to alter it, to resist alteration, or to do nothing. Moral decisions, therefore, cannot be logically deduced from descriptions, whether of social facts or of natural regularities. Decisions must be compatible with natural laws if they are to be carried out. A decision that all should work harder and eat less runs up against physiology, and one that all should work less and eat more runs up against economics and other social regularities. But incompatibility eliminates a decision as impracticable. It does not positively entail any decision. The objection that decisions are themselves psychological facts confuses the act of deciding with the norm adopted, as we must distinguish Napoleon's death from a historian's statement that Napoleon died on St. Helena. That norms are man-made does not mean they are arbitrary in the sense that one system is as good as any other. Mathematical calculi and symphonies are artificial, yet not interchangeable. Man has created worlds of language, music, poetry, science, and above all the world of moral demands for equality, freedom, and help for the weak. Moral decisions are not mere matters of taste like aesthetic preferences, nor luxuries. They concern the life and death of other men. The view that ethics is man-made is an attack on blind authority and tabooism, not on religion built on personal responsibility and freedom of conscience. Quote, "It is impossible to derive a sentence stating a norm or a decision or, say, a proposal for a policy from a sentence stating a fact. This is only another way of saying that it is impossible to derive norms or decisions or proposals from facts." Sociological laws and institutions. The autonomy of ethics does not imply that all regularities of social life are normative. On the contrary, there are important natural laws of social life, sociological laws, such as modern economic theories of trade and the trade cycle. These are connected with the functioning of institutions, which, like levers in mechanical engineering, multiply our power for good and evil and require intelligent supervision by someone who understands their purpose. Institutions are made by establishing the observance of norms. Even those arising as undesigned results of human action depend largely on norm observance. Normative laws and sociological laws are interwoven. We cannot understand institutions without distinguishing them. Intermediate positions blocking critical dualism. Between naive monism and critical dualism stand three intermediate positions, each usable to defend opposed ethical doctrines, power worship and the rights of the weak alike. Biological naturalism. Biological naturalism holds that moral and legal norms, though conventional in appearance, can be derived from eternal natural laws. Health, survival, the natural number of meals. Protagoras and Hippias appealed to natural equality. Plato and Aristotle advanced biological and moral inequality of men, Greeks and barbarians as natural masters and slaves. Since norms cannot be based on facts, this result is not surprising. Two further criticisms apply. Conformity with nature as supreme standard leads toward beastliness rather than civilization, and the naturalist always makes a choice. Some cherish things more than health, which he mistakes for derivation for biology. Ethical positivism. Ethical positivism reduces norms to existing positive law. What is good. Might is right. It is usually conservative or authoritarian, invoking God's authority or the alleged arbitrariness of alternatives. But the positivist's own norm, we must believe existing norms, either adds nothing or appeals to insight beyond positivism. Authoritarian principles, I believe, are often expressions of ethical nihilism, distrust of man's possibilities. Positivism can also be turned humanitarian. Why not be tolerant? showing how each intermediate position can serve opposite ends. Spiritual naturalism. Spiritual naturalism combines the conventionalist insight that norms express human nature with the biological naturalist's appeal to natural aims, not bread alone, but spiritual ends. Plato, under Socratic influence, first formulated this plausible position. It can justify humanitarian recognition of every individual's natural rights or Heraclitean contempt for the many who fill their bellies like the beasts. Because anything that has occurred to man can be called natural, spiritual naturalism can defend anything and, in practice, merge with positivism. Two tendencies block critical dualism: monism, the reduction of norms to facts, and the deeper fear of admitting that responsibility for ethical decisions is entirely ours, not shiftable to God, nature, society, or history. Quote, "Whatever authority we may accept, it is we who accept it. We only deceive ourselves if we do not realize this simple point." Plato's naturalism and historicist methodology. For Plato, nature is practically identical with essence, or form, the inborn quality transmitted from the divine primogeniture, as opposed to what is later imposed by external compulsion. Natural is prior, divine, true. Artificial is secondary, man-made, delusive. Soul is prior to body. Order and law spring from soul and therefore exist by nature. This spiritual naturalism is too vague for particular questions of just law. In practice, everything is left to the great lawgiver, a godlike philosopher, and the laws undoubtedly a self-portrait. Plato's theory of society's origin combines conventionalism with spiritual naturalism. Society begins in a contract motivated by self-interest, but rests on human nature's lack of self-sufficiency. Even the rare natures approaching perfection depend on society for this social habitat. The state is placed higher than the individual because only the state can be autarkic. Division of labor is introduced on biological naturalist grounds. Natural inequality of talents, with far-reaching consequences when the decisive division becomes rulers and ruled, wise and ignorant, masters and slaves. The organic or biological theory of the state as super-individual, the citizen an imperfect copy, introduces holism into the Occident. Plato's analogy serves analysis of the individual's soul, reason, spirit, appetite, mapped on a guardians, warriors, workers. Grote's remark captures the inversion. Man is many though apparently one. The perfect commonwealth one though apparently many. Holism expresses nostalgia for tribal unity. The permanent collective is real, passing individuals are not. Law welds citizens into one unit. The part exists for the whole. Quote, "You are created for the sake of the whole, and not the whole for the sake of you." The number, degeneration, and Plato's dualist ground plan. The problem of change and decay forces Plato to blame universal biological degeneration rather than the perfect city's constitution. Everything that has been generated must decay. Rulers of the first state lacked training in mathematics, dialectics, and the higher mysteries of eugenics, keeping pure the race of guardians. Empirical breeding cannot be exact. Perception deals with flux, not forms. Hence racial degeneration, mixture of metals, internal schism of the ruling class, and historical development as the history of society's breakdown. War as father of change. Plato's descriptive sociology brilliantly reconstructs early Greek tribal collectivism and the forces threatening its stability. But hatred of the society he lived in and romantic love for tribal life led to an untenable law of universal decay and to mysticism, metabiology of a human race culminating in the pseudo-rational mathematics of the Platonic number. The ground plan of Plato's thought exhibits a fundamental metaphysical dualism. Universal versus particular, one versus many, rational knowledge versus opinion, pure being versus becoming, good, preserving, versus evil, corrupting, the one collective state versus the many imperfect individuals whose particularity must be suppressed. This dualism, I believe, originated from the urgent wish to explain the contrast between an ideal, stable society and the hateful revolutionary actuality between rest and change. Quote, "The Platonic number is thus the setting in which Plato's philosophy of history is framed." Chapter 6, Totalitarian Justice. The analysis of Plato's sociology makes his political program easy to state. His fundamental demands admit of two formulae. The idealist, arrest all political change, for change is evil and rest divine, by making the state an exact copy of its form. And the naturalistic, back to nature, to the tribal patriarchy before the fall, to natural class rule of the wise few over the ignorant many. Practically all elements of the program derive from these demands, from historicism, and from the sociological conditions for stability of class rule. Strict class division, identification of the state's fate with the ruling class, monopoly of arms and education for rulers, censorship and propaganda, economic autarky. This is a totalitarian program founded on historicist sociology. Yet many readers believe Plato's doctrine is morally distinguished from modern totalitarianism by his love of goodness, beauty, wisdom, truth, justice, and the happiness of citizens. Crossman calls the Republic the most savage attack on liberal ideas in history, yet still thinks Plato aimed at a state in which every citizen is really happy. Joad finds fundamental differences from fascism because the ordinary man achieves such happiness as appertains to his nature, and the state rests on absolute good and justice. I believe, on the contrary, that Plato's program is fundamentally identical with totalitarianism, and that the contrary view rests on an ancient prejudice in favor of idealizing Plato, a prejudice Grote and Gompers began to shake without seeing all implications. Idealization permeates interpretations and even translations. Republic renders a Greek title with no liberal associations. The proper English would be the Constitution or the city-state. For the next 4 chapters, one break off historicism to examine the ethical ideas in Plato's political demands. Here, justice. What Plato meant by justice. What do we mean by justice? I do not think verbal questions of this kind are particularly important. Such terms are used in various senses. But most of us, especially those of humanitarian outlook, mean something like equal distribution of the burdens of citizenship, equal treatment before the law, law showing no favor to individuals, groups, or classes, impartial courts, equal share in the advantages of membership. If Plato meant anything of this kind, my claim that his program is purely totalitarian would be wrong. He meant something entirely different. In the Republic, I assert, he used just as a synonym for that which is in the interest of the best state, and the best state's interest is to arrest change by rigid class division and class rule. Justice is identified with the principle of class privilege. When each class minds its own business, the money-earning class as well as auxiliaries and guardians, then this is justice. Briefly and bluntly, the state is just if the ruler rules, the worker works, and the slave slaves. Humanitarian justice, equality of citizens in burdens, treatment, law, and advantages. Justice is relation between individuals. Platonic justice, health, strength, unity, stability of the whole state. Class privilege called just. Our justice means absence of privilege and some kind of equality in treatment of individuals. Plato's is a property of the whole based on relations between classes. Quote, "When each class in the city minds its own business, the money-earning class as well as the auxiliaries and the guardians, then this will be justice." Plato's innovation against Greek equalitarian usage. Was Plato right in a different sense? Did Greek usage mean holistic social justice? The claim that the Greek genius was metaphysical rather than legal is untenable. Plato himself, in the earlier Gorgias, reports that justice is equality is held by the great mass of the people and agrees with convention and nature itself. Aristotle, no equalitarian, says the judge personifies what is just and must restore equality. All men think justice a kind of equality pertaining to persons. Democratic justice applies arithmetical equality. This is universal and ancient popular usage. not merely Aristotle's personal impression. The holistic anti-equalitarian interpretation in the Republic was an innovation. Plato attempted to present totalitarian class rule as just, while people generally meant the opposite. Why claim justice meant inequality when usage meant equality? Likely propaganda. Persuade readers the totalitarian state is the just state. Words matter because justice symbolizes an aim for which many endure anything. Enlisting or paralyzing equalitarian forces was worth pursuing. Plato knew the power of faith in justice. Quote, "When a man believes that he has suffered injustice, does not his vigor and his wrath flare up at once? And is it not equally true that when fighting on the side of what he believes to be just, he can endure hunger and cold, and any kind of hardship, the omission of isonomy?" The Republic is the most elaborate monograph on justice ever written, yet the equalitarian theory of justice before the law, isonomy, is never mentioned. Either Plato overlooked it, improbable given his care and the popularity of equalitarianism, confirmed by the Gorgias and allusions in the Republic treated only with scorn, or he purposely avoided it. The latter alone explains silence broken only by jocular remarks, a conscious refusal incompatible with intellectual honesty, though explicable by devotion to a cause whose goodness he firmly believed. Equalitarianism represented all Plato hated. His theory was largely a reply to the powerful challenge of new equalitarianism and humanitarianism. Humanitarian demands and Platonic opposites. Humanitarian theory of justice makes three demands: equalitarian elimination of natural privileges, b. individualism, c. the state's task to protect citizens' freedom. To each corresponds a Platonic opposite: a1. natural privilege for natural leaders, b1. holism or collectivism, c1. the individual's task to maintain the state's stability. Equalitarianism and natural inequality. Equalitarianism demands impartial treatment regardless of birth, connection, or wealth. Privileges only those conferred by citizens on those they trust. Pericles' funeral oration admirably formulates this. Equal justice in private disputes, excellence preferred to public service as reward for merit, poverty no bar. Plato demanded natural privileges for natural leaders. He quickly exploited the weakness of naturalistic arguments in equalitarian doctrine, sentimental appeal of equality versus stronger propaganda of superiority. Are you naturally equal to your servants? The ridiculous question became a weapon. In the Menexenus, he ironically links equal laws with natural equality. In the laws he summarizes, equal treatment of unequals must beget inequity, developed by Aristotle into equality for equals, inequality for unequals. The standard objection, equality would be excellent if men were equal, is unrealistic since privileges have never rested on natural character differences. In the Republic, Plato prefers to forget equalitarianism rather than argue it. Individualism, collectivism, and Plato's false dilemma. Individualism, since opposed to collectivism, not to altruism, must be distinguished from egoism, opposed to altruism. Collectivism demands the individual subserve the whole. It is not identical with altruism. Class egoism is common. An individualist can be an altruist, ready to sacrifice for other individuals, as in Dickens's passionate interest in concrete persons and distrust of devotion to anonymous groups, Mrs. Jellyby. For Plato, altruistic individualism cannot exist. He identifies all individualism with egoism and all altruism with collectivism, reducing four possibilities to two. This confusion has damaged ethical speculation down to our own day. Defending collectivism, he appeals to unselfishness. Attacking individualism, he brands individual as selfish, though his attack reaches only egoism. Individualism, united with altruism, was part of the emancipation that broke tribalism and raised democracy. Pericles linked equal justice with not nagging the neighbor who goes his own way, and with protecting the injured, self-reliant versatility for the young Athenian. It is the central doctrine of Christianity and of Kant's practical ethics. Recognize human individuals as ends. Plato hated this doctrine as enemy of his caste state. The law's passages on the republic as highest form. Common wives, children, chattels, eradicating the private even in eyes and ears, and on permanent mobilization. Nobody without a leader, no initiative even in washing or meals, total community in war and peace, are among the most anti-humanitarian in Western thought, yet have been idealized as humane and Christian. The Pythagorean maxim, friends have all things in common, opens arguments that arrive at the opposite of its spirit. Thrasymachus' might is right is replaced by the equally barbaric doctrine that right is what furthers the stability and might of the state. Quote, "The greatest principle of all is that nobody, whether male or female, should ever be without a leader, nor should the mind of anybody be habituated to letting him do anything at all on his own initiative." Justice as political hygiene. Plato's third argument for justice. Intermingling of classes means downfall. Harm to the city is utmost wickedness, therefore injustice. Conversely, each class attending to its business is justice. Granting the sociological assumption that only rigid caste arrests change, and that harm means anything threatening change, the inference follows, but the whole trend is dominated by, does this harm the city? Plato recognizes one ultimate standard, the interest of the state. What furthers it is good, virtuous, just. What threatens it is bad, wicked, unjust. Morality is political hygiene, the tribal, totalitarian theory. Good is what is in the interest of my group, tribe, or state. Internationally, the state can do no wrong while strong. It may attack others if it does not weaken itself. Amorality Hegel later drew explicitly from totalitarian ethics. Keeping one's place is virtue corresponding to military discipline. Fitness for task plus staying in place. Universal virtue of the whole is harmony, named justice. If the individual is a cog, ethics studies how to fit him into the whole. I believe Plato's totalitarianism was sincere, stability of the whole, not maximum exploitation. Though exploitation must stay within limits lest guardians lose all, Hesiod's half is more than the whole. Restricting class privilege is itself a common totalitarian ingredient. Totalitarianism is collective selfishness, the morality of the closed society. Why the lengthy preface and weak prior arguments? Plato knew the moral appeal of forces he tried to break and did not dare challenge openly. Whether cynically employing humanitarian sentiments or tragically persuading his better conscience, we cannot know. My impression, inner conflict is Plato's fascination. Amid totalitarianism, humanitarian ideas appear, enabling philosophers to represent him as humanitarian. Protectionism and Lycophron's distorted legacy. The humanitarian state is approached by political demands, not essentialist or historicist questions. What do we demand? Protection for ourselves and others against aggression. Distinction between aggression and defense. Status quo changeable only by law, compromise, or arbitration. We accept curtailed freedom for protected freedom. The state should limit freedom as equally as possible. This protectionist theory is liberal yet not laissez-faire. Freedom needs state guarantee. Some state control and education protects capacity for freedom, but too much leads to indoctrination. Borderline cases are welcome. They keep citizens fighting for freedom. Stated as demands, protectionism is free of historicism. Conventionalists who describe the state as originating from mutual protection may have meant this demand in clumsy historicist language. Aristotle and Burke criticized protectionism as too mean a view. The state is higher, must care for virtue. Translated into demands, state worship is a religious problem. Political demand is moral tutelage by officers of state, expanding legality at expense of morality proper, a step toward totalitarianism. Lycophron, pupil of Gorgias, first proffered protectionism clearly. Law as covenant assuring justice, state as cooperative association for prevention of crime, concerned with the end of the state, not historical contract. Objections: no historical contract. Laws precede codes. Strength lies in moral will. hit historicist versions, not Lycophron. Barker's charge of selfishness misreads protection. Protect the weak from the strong. Plato knew Lycophron's theory. In the Gorgias, Callicles opposes it, but Socrates defends equalitarian protectionist elements. In the Republic, Glaucon presents the same theory as development of Thrasymachus nihilism, turning humanitarian readers against protectionism by associating it with the doctrine that injustice is excellent for those who can get away with it. Plato's complete change of front persuaded Platonists and opponents alike that individualism equals selfishness and contract theory rests on nihilism, from Carneades to Hobbes. Quote, "The laws are made by the great mass of the people, which consists mainly of the weak men, and they make the laws in order to protect themselves and their interests." Summing up, Plato's theory of justice in the Republic is a conscious attempt to defeat equalitarian, individualist, protectionist tendencies and re-establish tribalism through totalitarian moral theory, avoiding honest discussion of equalitarianism while enlisting humanitarian sentiments for natural class rule. Justice serves might, health, and stability of the state. The question remains whether the demand that the wisest and best should rule modifies this character. Chapter 7. The Principle of Leadership. Certain objections to our interpretation of Plato's program force an examination of moral ideas, justice, goodness, beauty, wisdom, truth, happiness within that program. Justice we have treated. Wisdom and the demand that the wisest should rule occupy this chapter. Plato's justice demands that natural rulers rule and natural slaves slave. Historicism demands the state as copy of its idea. The fundamental political question becomes, who shall rule? The confusion of who should rule. It is my conviction that by expressing the problem of politics as who should rule, or whose will should be supreme, Plato created a lasting confusion. Once the question is asked, it is hard to avoid the best, the wisest, the born ruler, he who masters the art of ruling, or, in later ages, the general will, the master race, the industrial workers, the people. Such a reply sounds convincing. Who would advocate rule by the greatest fool? Yet it is quite useless. Those who share Plato's assumption admit rulers are not always good or wise, and that reliable government is hard to obtain. If so, should not political thought face from the beginning the possibility of bad government? Prepare for the worst leaders and hope for the best? This replaces who should rule with how can we organize institutions so bad or incompetent rulers are prevented from doing too much damage? Theory of sovereignty. Political power is essentially unchecked. The main question is getting power into the best hands. Theory of checks and balances. Institutional control of rulers by balancing power against other powers. Believers in sovereignty assume power is essentially uncontrolled. One individual or collective can, nearly, do what he wills and strengthen power toward the unlimited. Even extreme sovereignty is never pure. Tyrants depend on police, henchmen, hangmen. They must make concessions and play groups against each other. My criticism does not depend on the empirical point that rulers are rarely above average morally or intellectually, though I am inclined to think they are often below it, and that preparing for the worst is reasonable in politics. The paradoxes of sovereignty. All theories of sovereignty are paradoxical. Democracy's paradox. What if the people will not to rule but a tyrant? Democrats who base everything on majority rule face paralysis. Oppose the tyranny or accept the majority's decision. Institutional control, right to dismiss government by majority vote, needs better grounds than self-contradictory sovereignty. Similarly, the wisest may decide the best should rule, and the best that the majority should. Even kingship of the law is open to Heraclitus's remark that the law can demand one man's will be obeyed. Democracy as anti-tyranny. A democratic theory free of the paradox of sovereignty can be developed from the decision to avoid and resist tyranny. Distinguished governments we can get rid of without bloodshed, by elections, with traditions protecting institutions, from those removable only by revolution. Call the first democracy, the second tyranny or dictatorship. Labels matter less than the institutional content. The democratic principle, create develop, and protect institutions for avoiding tyranny. This does not claim institutions are foolproof or that democratic policies are wise, only that accepting a bad policy peacefully while working for change is preferable to submitting to tyranny, however benevolent. Equalitarian methods, elections, representation, are reasonably effective safeguards open to improvement. He who accepts democracy is not bound to treat a majority vote as authoritative truth. He may combat it by democratic means. If the majority destroys democratic institutions, that shows no foolproof method exists. It need not weaken the fight against tyranny. Quote, "The theory of democracy is not based upon the principle that the majority should rule. Rather, the various equalitarian methods of democratic control are to be considered as no more than well-tried and reasonably effective institutional safeguards against tyranny." Leadership as institutional problem. Plato's emphasis on who should rule eliminates institutional control before it is raised. Interest shifts to personnel and selecting natural leaders. Some think Platonism makes welfare an ethical matter of persons rather than institutions. I believe this is superficial. All long-term politics are institutional. Leadership does not replace institutional problems. It creates new ones, especially selecting future leaders. Opposition between balances and sovereignty is not institutionalism versus personalism. Both elements are always present. Institutions are like fortresses, well-designed and manned. Critics dissatisfied because democracies fall short of moral standards misunderstand what institutions may do. Democracy provides framework for reform without violence, for reason in designing institutions. It cannot provide reason or moral standard of citizens. That is largely personal. Blaming democracy for shortcomings blames citizens. In non-democratic states, reasonable reform requires violent overthrow and democratic framework. Distinguish problems of the day, largely personal, from building the future, institutional. Plato's principle that the best should rule makes the future leader selection the educational department's task and corrupts education. Socratic intellectualism versus Platonic authoritarianism. Plato's theory likely owes elements to Socrates. Moral intellectualism. Goodness identified with wisdom. Nobody acts against better knowledge. Moral excellence teachable through universal intelligence. Socrates criticized all government, yet was loyal to law. Under democracy, he exposed incompetent leaders without anti-democratic leanings. He opposed tyranny courageously under the 30. He may have demanded the best rule, the wisest who know justice, but justice for him meant equalitarian justice, Gorgias, and he was the greatest apostle of individualistic ethics. He stressed not learned men, but realization of how little one knows. Agnostic attitude is true scientific spirit, not mere lack of ancient scientific success. Socratic intellectualism is equalitarian. Everyone can be taught. Meno's slave and Pythagoras. Anti-authoritarian. Real knowledge taught by midwifery, self-criticism, critical reliance on one's insight. Demand that the intellectually honest rule differs from rule by the most learned or most noble. Yet intellectualism's stress on enlightenment can be misread as authoritarianism. Those not educated enough cannot judge their deficiencies and need authority to wake them. Balanced in Socrates by authority, claiming no more than demonstrating self-criticism, the uneducated lack. Distortion into Platonic demand that state mold citizens' moral life supports proof that democratic control is vicious. How can the uneducated judge educators? Entièrement Socratique. State authority produces dogmatic complacency, not Socratic dissatisfaction. Crossman's agreement with Plato on state education opens the door to totalitarianism. Athenian laissez-faire enabled Socrates to teach. Its abandonment led to his death. State must ensure education for participation and opportunity regardless of capacity to pay. Protective function, but invoking state interest to mold children's minds by proven probity endangers intellectual freedom. Laissez-faire with teachers is infinitely superior to state monopoly backing expert authority. teaching science as doctrine, destroying inquiry. Plato's Republic Socrates is unmitigated authoritarianism, indoctrination, molding souls utterly incapable of doing anything at all independently. Equalitarian link of reason between men replaced by educational monopoly and censorship. Socrates disclaimed wisdom and possession of truth. Plato's lover is proud possessor. Dialectician seeing eternal forms, godlike in wisdom and power. Philosopher king contrasts with modest rational individualist versus totalitarian demigod. Selecting rulers in personalist theory might leave succession to the wise ruler's choice. Too much depends on accident. Planning for the future requires institutionalism. The educational department holds the keys to power. Higher grades controlled by rulers. Only wisest adepts initiate into dialectics and divine originals. The self-contradiction of selecting leaders. Plato fears thought's power. All great things are dangerous, and restricts dialectics to those past military age, when independent thought is unlikely. Young guardians fight. Old men receive dogma to hand on collectivism and authoritarianism. Later he allows dialectics from 30 with caution, full initiation into good only at 50. Why no originality in leaders? Plato hates change. Deeper, selecting future leaders is self-contradictory. Physical excellence may be ascertained. Intellectual excellence requires independence and spirit of criticism. Authoritarianism selects obedient believers, mediocrities, never admits that those who defy authority may be most valuable. Military and party advancement eliminate independent thought. Institutions for selecting the outstanding can work for arresting change, but eliminate initiative if we demand more. Burdening education with selecting the best turns studies into hurdle races for personal ambition rather than love of inquiry. Plato invented secondary schools and universities. Yet truth and decency survive, testimony to human stubborn health. Plato's own selectors produced tyrants among pupils. Dion, Callippus, Clercus, illustrating Acton's truth that power corrupts. Quote, "The very idea of selecting or educating future leaders is self-contradictory. You may solve the problem, perhaps, to some degree in the field of bodily excellence. But the secret of intellectual excellence is intellectual independence." To sum up, Plato's program was more institutional than personalist. Educational control of succession on authoritarian learning, expert, and man of proven probity. He made of Socrates' demand that responsible politicians love truth and know their limitations a demand for possession of truth by learned experts. Sophocracy with mystical marks distinguishing rulers from ruled. Political medicine for permanent class rule. Chapter 8. The Philosopher King. The contrast between Platonic and Socratic creed is greater than we have shown. Plato followed Socrates in defining the philosopher as lover of truth, those who love truth. Yet he does not quite believe it, for he declares it the ruler's business to tell lies, deceiving enemies and citizens for the city's benefit. No one else may touch this privilege. Ruled must tell truth, rulers punished if they lie. Only in this sense are philosopher kings lovers of truth. Totalitarian morality overrules even the definition of the philosopher. Lies, medicine, and the myth of the metals. Plato illustrates collective utility by the physician. Medicine is politics. Aesculapius is a politician. Medical art must not prolong life as aim, but serve the state. No time for falling ill. The useless man and his probably sick children burden the state. Lies are useful only as medicine. The ruler must be courageous enough to administer many lies and deceptions for the ruled, for the state. Kant's distinction remains. Truthfulness may not be the best policy, but truthfulness is better than policy. Crossman rightly emphasizes propaganda lies for the rule majority, but I cannot agree that rulers form a fully enlightened intelligentsia. Plato twice hopes even rulers, after generations, may believe his greatest propaganda lie. Racialism, the myth of blood and soil, metals and man and earthborn, to strengthen master race rule and arrest change. He introduces the myth with blunt admission of fraud. One lordly lie may persuade rulers. If lucky, hoax them, at any rate the rest. Persuasion here means misleading. After a lengthy, uneasy preface, the myth strengthens defense of mother country, warriors autochthonous, and asserts hereditary metals, gold in rulers, silver in auxiliaries, iron and copper in producers. Early concession that base-born children with gold may rise is rescinded in the false story. Only downward movement. Mixing metals begets strife. Oracle that city perishes when guarded by iron and copper. Plato knew racialism opposed democratic humanitarianism. Adam's praise, guarantee in faith rather than reason, unintentionally places religion on the level of opportunist lie. Plato is more conventionalist than Protagoras, who thought laws made with divine inspiration, religion established by convention, invention. Critias, leader of the 30, first glorified propaganda, lies in verse. Religion as lordly lie of the clever statesman. Plato's attitude in politics matches Critias' opportunism, severest punishment for honest dissenters, nocturnal council of inquisitors. Gods punish collectivism's enemies, never appeased by prayer, political interest clear. We should give Plato benefit of doubt on sincerity of arresting change, but he subjects Socratic love of truth to strengthening masterclass rule. Truth is less radically pragmatic than justice. Plato admits he is lying. Quote, could we perhaps fabricate one of those very handy lies which indeed we mentioned just recently? With the help of one single lordly lie we may, if we are lucky, persuade even the rulers themselves, but at any rate the rest of the city. Sophocracy, possessor, founder, preserver. Why philosophers as kings? If philosophers love truth, yet kings must lie. Plato means something different. Not devoted seeker, but proud possessor. Learned sage, Sophocracy. Functions divide into founding and preserving the city. The founder must copy the divine form of the state. Only the dialectician sees the heavenly original and sketches the ground plan. Painter of constitutions letting eyes wander from model to picture. Idea of the good is highest form, son of the intelligible world, source of existence and knowledge. Indispensable formal role, but no direct ethical content beyond collectivist code. Infallibus, good is measure. Lecture on the good disappointed audiences with empty formalism. Practical suggestion. Good preserves, evil corrupts, arrested rest. Wisdom means not Socratic insight into limitations, nor helpful understanding of humanity, but learning revealing eternal reality, arresting change. Preservation requires unity of masterclass. Upbringing is sovereign's great task. Why philosopher as director of education rather than soldier king? Not because system must produce philosophers, circular. Plato feared independent thought. Highest aim is inarticulate knowledge of good. Philosophical education establishes unchallengeable authority. Supernatural, mystical, tribal priest-king echoes. Barrier between rulers and ruled. Political medicine, shaman's mark. Permanent function analogous to lawgiver. Breeding, the master race. The breeder king and the key passage. Without philosopher king, state degenerates. Guardians unaware of Pythagorean lore and Platonic number. Racialism is central. Nuptial number frames descriptive sociology and political demand for philosopher sovereignty. King is breeder king. Philosopher is philosophic breeder. Rational breeding needs a pattern. Platonic idea of race. Only dialectician sees divine original of man. Not universal concept man, but unchanging super-Greek supermaster, nobly born men of awe-inspiring character, godlike, sculptured in perfect beauty. Two functions analogous. Copy divine city and divine man. Realize heavenly vision in individual and city. Careful animal breeding prompts demand for surpassing excellence in human rulers. Lies necessary if herd reaches highest perfection. Arrangements secret from all but rulers. Appeal for courage in administering lies precedes ingenious balloting for mating and glauconic edict. Wartime duty to submit to the brave's wishes for eugenic hero production. Philosophical breeding counters degeneration. Fully qualified philosopher trained in pure mathematics, astronomy, harmonics, dialectics, secrets of mathematical eugenics, and Platonic number restore pre-fall happiness. The central demand. Philosopher kings, or kings becoming philosophers, fusion of might and philosophy, suppression of those following only one, promises end to evil in cities, and Plato adds, in the race of men. Kant wisely replied kings should not become philosophers nor philosophers kings. Power debases reason. Kings or self-ruling peoples should leave philosophers' public utterance. Race of men is not humanity transcending nations, ethical category of humanity foreign to Plato. Allusion is to racial degeneration theory. Without genuine philosopher trained in eugenics, state lost. Only Plato knew the secret. Philosopher king is Plato himself, heir of Codrus. Quote, unless in their cities philosophers are vested with the might of kings, where those now called kings and oligarchs become genuine and fully qualified philosophers. And unless these two, political might and philosophy, are fused, there can be no rest, and the evil will not cease to be rampant in the cities, nor, I believe, in the race of men. Self-portrait and the decline from Socrates. Republic is topical political manifesto. Philosopher kings mean contemporary philosophers. Antisthenes, Isocrates, Plato. Personal passage. Alcibiades deserted philosophy. Unworthy suitors claimed her. Handful worthy. Plato's sour confession of caged philosopher among savages, holding peace for his work. Contrast with natural ruler whom the sick should besiege, not beg. Did he believe they would come? Hopes alternated with despair of laughter, defamation, death. Reaching for godlikeness. Even anti-ambition arguments inspire. Philosopher not eager to rule because status too high, yet ready as natural savior. Behind sovereignty stands quest for power. Beautiful portrait is self-portrait. Fortified with Socrates' irony, we may find human features. Pity for Plato establishing first professorship instead of kingship, kingly idea after his own image. Melancholy resemblance to innocent satire, great dog formed after own image. Monument of human smallness beside Socratic simplicity, warning statesmen against dazzle of power, teaching we are frail human beings. Decline from irony and reason to magical sage above ordinary men, not high enough to forego lies or shaman's trade. Breeding spells for power over fellow men. Quote, what a decline from this world of irony and reason and truthfulness down to Plato's kingdom of the sage whose magical powers raise him high above ordinary men, although not quite high enough to forego the use of lies, or to neglect the sorry trade of every shaman, the selling of spells, of breeding spells, in exchange for power over his fellow men. Chapter 9. Aestheticism, Perfectionism, Utopianism. Popper opens this chapter with a line from Roger Martin Dugard. Everything has got to be smashed to start with, because the temper it expresses is not marginal but recurrent. The conviction that civilization itself must be destroyed before decency can begin. That mood, I believe, is the emotional fuel behind a methodological choice Plato bequeathed to politics, and one I consider among the most dangerous in the history of social thought. I call it utopian engineering, and I oppose it to piecemeal engineering, which seems to me the only rational approach to the improvement of institutions. Utopian and piecemeal social engineering. Inherent in Plato's program, there's a certain approach towards politics which, I believe, is most dangerous. Its analysis is of great practical importance from the point of view of rational social engineering. The Platonic approach I have in mind can be described as that of utopian engineering, as opposed to another kind of social engineering which I consider as the only rational one, and which may be described by the name of piecemeal engineering. The utopian approach is the more dangerous, as it may seem to be the obvious alternative to an out-and-out historicism, to a radically historicist approach which implies that we cannot alter the course of history. At the same time, it appears to be a necessary complement to a less radical historicism, like that of Plato, which permits human interference. Any rational action must have a certain aim. It is rational in the same degree as it pursues its aim consciously and consistently, and as it determines its means according to this end. To choose the end is therefore the first thing we have to do if we wish to act rationally. And we must be careful to determine our real or ultimate ends, for which we must distinguish clearly those intermediate or partial ends which actually are only means or steps on the way to the ultimate end. If we neglect this distinction, then we must also neglect to ask whether these partial ends are likely to promote the ultimate end, and accordingly, we must fail to act rationally. These principles, if applied to the realm of political activity, demand that we must determine our ultimate political aim or the ideal state before taking any practical action. Only when this ultimate aim is determined, in rough outline at least, only when we are in possession of something like a blueprint of the society at which we aim, only then can we begin to consider the best ways and means for its realization and to draw up a plan for practical action. These are the necessary preliminaries of any practical political move that can be called rational, and especially of social engineering. This, in brief, is the methodological approach which I call utopian engineering. It is convincing and attractive. In fact, it is just the kind of methodological approach to attract all those who are either unaffected by historicist prejudices or reacting against them. This makes it only the more dangerous, and its criticism the more imperative. Before proceeding to criticize utopian engineering in detail, I wish to outline another approach to social engineering, namely that of piecemeal engineering. It is an approach which I think to be methodologically sound. The politician who adopts this method may or may not have a blueprint of society before his mind. He may or may not hope that mankind will one day realize an ideal state and achieve happiness and perfection on earth. But he will be aware that perfection, if at all attainable, is far distant, and that every generation of men, and therefore also the living, have a claim, perhaps not so much a claim to be made happy, for there are no institutional means of making a man happy, but a claim not to be made unhappy, where it can be avoided. They have a claim to be given all possible help if they suffer. Piecemeal engineering, the method of searching for and fighting against the greatest and most urgent evils of society, rather than searching for and fighting for its greatest ultimate good. This difference is far from being merely verbal. It is the difference between a reasonable method of improving the lot of man and a method which, if really tried, may easily lead to an intolerable increase in human suffering. The piecemeal engineer can claim that a systematic fight against suffering and injustice and war is more likely to be supported by the approval and agreement of a great number of people than the fight for the establishment of some ideal. The existence of social evils, that is to say, of social conditions under which many men are suffering, can be comparatively well established. Those who suffer can judge for themselves, and the others can hardly deny that they would not like to change places. It is infinitely more difficult to reason about an ideal society. Social life is so complicated that few men, or none at all, could judge a blueprint for social engineering on the grand scale, whether it be practicable, whether it would result in a real improvement, what kind of suffering it may involve, and what may be the means for its realization. As opposed to this, blueprints for piecemeal engineering are comparatively simple. They are blueprints for single institutions, for health and unemployed insurance, for instance or arbitration courts, or anti-depression budgeting, or educational reform. If they go wrong, the damage is not very great, and a readjustment not very difficult. They are less risky, and for this very reason, less controversial. But if it is easier to reach a reasonable agreement about existing evils and the means of combating them than it is about an ideal good and the means of its realization, then there is also more hope that by using the piecemeal method, we may get over the very greatest practical difficulty of all reasonable political reform, namely, the use of reason instead of passion and violence in executing the program. Quote, as opposed to that, the utopian attempt to realize an ideal state using a blueprint of society as a whole, is one which demands a strong, centralized rule of a few, and which therefore is likely to lead to a dictatorship. This I consider a criticism of the utopian approach, for I have tried to show, in the chapter on the principle of leadership, that an authoritarian rule is a most objectionable form of government. Why utopian blueprints fail the test of reform. One of the difficulties faced by a benevolent dictator is to find whether the effects of his measures agree with his good intentions. The difficulty arises out of the fact that authoritarianism must discourage criticism. Accordingly, the benevolent dictator will not easily hear of complaints concerning the measures he has taken. But without some such check, he can hardly find out whether his measures achieve the desired benevolent aim. The situation must become even worse for the utopian engineer. The reconstruction of society is a big undertaking which must cause considerable inconvenience to many, and for a considerable span of time. Accordingly, the utopian engineer will have to be deaf to many complaints. In fact, it will be part of his business to suppress unreasonable objections. But with it, he must invariably suppress reasonable criticism also. We make such experiments all the time. The introduction of a new kind of life insurance, of a new kind of taxation, of a new penal reform are all social experiments which have their repercussions through the whole of society, without remodeling society as a whole. Even a man who opens a new shop, or who reserves a ticket for the theater, is carrying out a kind of social experiment on a small scale, and all our knowledge of social conditions is based on experience gained by making experiments of this kind. The utopian engineer is right when he stresses that an experiment in socialism would be of little value if carried out under laboratory conditions, for instance, in an isolated village, since what we want to know is how things work out in society under normal social conditions. But this very example shows where the prejudice of the utopian engineer lies. He is convinced that we must recast the whole structure of society when we experiment with it, and he can therefore conceive a more modest experiment only as one that recasts the whole structure of small society. But the kind of experiment from which we can learn most is the alteration of one social institution at a time. For only in this way can we learn how to fit institutions into the framework of other institutions, and how to adjust them so that they work according to our intentions. And only in this way can we make mistakes and learn from our mistakes without risking repercussions of a gravity that must endanger the will to future reforms. Furthermore, the utopian method must lead to a dangerous dogmatic attachment to a blueprint for which countless sacrifices have been made. Powerful interests must become linked up with the success of the experiment. All this does not contribute to the rationality or to the scientific value of the experiment. But the piecemeal method permits repeated experiments and continuous readjustments. Scientific politics, not utopian planning or historical prophecy, but a readiness to learn from mistakes. The whole secret of scientific method is a readiness to learn from mistakes. The mechanical engineer can plan a factory as a whole only because he has sufficient experience at his disposal, theories developed by trial and error. In other words, because he relies on experience which he has gained by applying piecemeal methods. His new machinery is the result of a great many small improvements. Similarly, Marx's criticism of utopianism and mine have realism in common. We both believe that utopian plans will never be realized in the way they were conceived. But Marx, in arguing against utopianism, condemns in fact all social engineering, a point which is rarely understood. What he shares with Plato is the sweep of utopianism, its attempt to deal with society as a whole, leaving no stone unturned, its uncompromising radicalism in the original sense of going to the root of the matter. Aestheticism, canvas cleaning, and romanticism. This sweep, I believe, is connected with aestheticism, with a desire to build a world which is not only a little better and more rational than ours, but which is free from all its ugliness. Not a crazy quilt, an old garment badly patched, but an entirely new gown, a really beautiful new world. This aesthetic enthusiasm becomes valuable only if it is bridled by reason, by a feeling of responsibility, and by a humanitarian urge to help. Otherwise, it is a dangerous enthusiasm, liable to develop into a form of neurosis or hysteria. Nowhere do we find this aestheticism more strongly expressed than in Plato. Plato was an artist, and like many of the best artists, he tried to visualize a model, the divine original of his work, and to copy it faithfully. Politics, to Plato, is the royal art, an art of composition, like music, painting, or architecture. The Platonic politician composes cities for beauty's sake. But here I must protest. I do not believe that human lives may be made the means for satisfying an artist's desire for self-expression. We must demand, rather, that every man should be given, if he wishes, the right to model his life himself, as far as this does not interfere too much with others. Quote, "They will take as their canvas a city and the characters of men, and they will, first of all, make their canvas clean, by no means an easy matter. But this is just the point, where they will differ from all others. They will not start work on a city, nor on an individual, nor will they draw up laws, unless they are given a clean canvas or have cleaned it themselves." The kind of thing Plato has in mind when he speaks of canvas cleaning is explained a little later. "All citizens above the age of 10, Socrates answers, must be expelled from the city and deported somewhere into the country. And the children who are now free from the influence of the manners and habits of their parents must be taken over. This is the way in which the artist-politician must proceed. He must eradicate the existing institutions and traditions. He must purify, purge, expel, banish, and kill. But all this radicalism and violence is both unrealistic and futile, as Russia's development showed when Lenin, after the economic breakdown to which the canvas cleaning of so-called war communism had led, introduced his new economic policy, in fact a kind of piecemeal engineering. What some people have in mind who speak of our social system and of the need to replace it by another system is very similar to a picture painted on a canvas which has to be wiped clean before one can paint a new one. But the painter and those who cooperate with him, his dreams and plans for a better world, and his standards of decency and morality are all part of the social system, of the picture to be wiped out. If they were really to clean the canvas, they would have to destroy themselves and their utopian plans. The political artist clamors, like Archimedes, for a place outside the social world on which he can take his stand, in order to lever it off its hinges. But such a place does not exist, and the social world must continue to function during any reconstruction. In all matters, we can only learn by trial and error, by making mistakes and improvements. We can never rely on inspiration, although inspirations may be most valuable as long as they can be checked by experience. Those who dislike piecemeal methods as insufficiently radical would have again to wipe out their freshly constructed society in order to start anew with a clean canvas. And since the new start, for the same reasons, would not lead to perfection either, they would have to repeat this process without ever getting anywhere. Romanticism, the irrational attitude which springs from an intoxication with dreams of a beautiful world, whether it preaches back to nature or forward to a world of love and beauty. Its appeal is always to our emotions rather than to reason. Even with the best intentions of making heaven on earth, it only succeeds in making it a hell, that hell which man alone prepares for his fellow man. Quote, "The politician who adopts this method may or may not have a blueprint of society before his mind, but he will be aware that perfection, if at all attainable, is far distant, and that every generation of men, and therefore also the living, have a claim not to be made unhappy where it can be avoided." Chapter 10. The Open Society and Its Enemies. There is still something missing from our analysis. The contention that Plato's political program is purely totalitarian, and the objections to this contention, which were raised in Chapter 6, have led us to examine the part played within this program by such moral ideas as justice, wisdom, truth, and beauty. The result of this examination was always the same. We found that the role of these ideas is important, but that they do not lead Plato beyond totalitarianism and racialism. But one of these ideas we have still to examine, that of happiness. Crossman's belief that Plato's program is fundamentally a plan for the building of a perfect state in which every citizen is really happy, I described as a relic of the tendency to idealize Plato, for Plato's treatment of happiness is exactly analogous to his treatment of justice, based upon the same belief that society is by nature divided into classes or castes. True happiness, Plato insists, is achieved only by justice, i.e. by keeping one's place. Yet when I put the matter bluntly, Plato, as totalitarian party politician, successful in propaganda for the arrest and overthrow of a civilization he hated, I felt that something was seriously amiss with this interpretation. Not so much that it was untrue, but that it was defective. I therefore began to search for evidence which would refute this interpretation. In every point but one, this attempt was quite unsuccessful. The new material made the identity between Platonism and totalitarianism only the more manifest. The one point in which my search succeeded concerned Plato's hatred of tyranny. I felt that certain of his observations on tyranny were sincere, and that this did not remove the need for modifying my interpretation. A new picture was needed, which would have to include Plato's sincere belief in his mission as healer of the sick social body, as well as the fact that he had seen more clearly than anybody else before or after him what was happening to Greek society. My attempt to understand Plato by analogy with modern totalitarianism led me, to my own surprise, to modify my view of totalitarianism itself. It did not modify my hostility, but it ultimately led me to see that the strength of both the old and the new totalitarian movements rested on the fact that they attempted to answer a very real need, however badly conceived this attempt may have been. In the light of my new interpretation, it appears to me that Plato's declaration of his wish to make the state and its citizens happy is not merely propaganda. I am ready to grant his fundamental benevolence. I also grant that he was right, to a limited extent, in the sociological analysis on which he based his promise of happiness. Plato, with deep sociological insight, found that his contemporaries were suffering under a severe strain, and that this strain was due to the social revolution which had begun with the rise of democracy and individualism. He succeeded in discovering the main causes of their deeply rooted unhappiness, social change, and social dissension, and he did his utmost to fight them. The recommendation, though not practicable as a therapy, testifies to Plato's power of diagnosis. It is my intention to give in this chapter a very brief survey of the historical material which induced me to hold such opinions. From tribalism to the open society, our Western civilization originated with the Greeks. They were, it seems, the first to make the step from tribalism to humanitarianism. The closed society and its magic. The early Greek tribal society resembles in many respects that of peoples like the Polynesians, the Maoris for instance. Small bands of warriors, usually living in fortified settlements, ruled by tribal chiefs or kings or by aristocratic families, were waging war against one another on sea as well as on land. There are some characteristics that can be found in most, if not all, of these tribal societies. I mean their magical or irrational attitude towards the customs of social life, and the corresponding rigidity of these customs. The magical attitude towards social custom has as its main element the lack of distinction between the customary or conventional regularities of social life and the regularities found in nature, and this often goes together with the belief that both are enforced by a supernatural will. The rigidity of the social customs is probably in most cases only another aspect of the same attitude. When I speak of the rigidity of tribalism, I do not mean that no changes can occur in the tribal ways of life. I mean rather that the comparatively infrequent changes have the character of religious conversions or revulsions, or of the introduction of new magical taboos. They're not based upon a rational attempt to improve social conditions. Apart from such changes, which are rare, taboos rigidly regulate and dominate all aspects of life. They do not leave many loopholes. There are few problems in this form of life, and nothing really equivalent to moral problems. Closed society, the magical or tribal or collectivist society, one in which institutions leave no room for personal responsibility in the modern sense, and in which the right way is always determined by taboos rather than by critical reflection. Personal decisions and the open society. It is well known how much of this still survives. Our own ways of life are still beset with taboos. Food taboos, taboos of politeness, and many others. And yet, there are some important differences. In our own way of life, there is between the laws of the state on the one hand and the taboos we habitually observe on the other, an ever-widening field of personal decisions, with its problems and responsibilities, and we know the importance of this field. Personal decisions may lead to the alteration of taboos and even of political laws which are no longer taboos. The great difference is the possibility of rational reflection upon these matters. Rational reflection begins, in a way, with Heraclitus, with Alcmaeon, Phaleas, and Hippodamus, with Herodotus and the Sophists. The quest for the best constitution assumes, by degrees, the character of a problem which can be rationally discussed. In what follows, the magical or tribal or collectivist society will also be called the closed society, and a society in which individuals are confronted with personal decisions, the open society. A closed society, at its best, can be justly compared to an organism. The so-called organic or biological theory of the state can be applied to it to a considerable extent. A closed society resembles a herd or a tribe in being a semi-organic unit whose members are held together by semi-biological ties. Kinship, living together, sharing common efforts, common dangers, common joys, and common distress. Those aspects are lacking which make it impossible to apply the organic theory successfully to an open society, connected with the fact that, in an open society, many members strive to rise socially and to take the places of other members. This may lead to such an important social phenomenon as class struggle. We cannot find anything like class struggle in an organism. The abstract society. As a consequence of its loss of organic character, an open society may become, by degrees, what I should like to term an abstract society. We could conceive of a society in which men practically never meet face to face, in which all business is conducted by individuals in isolation who communicate by typed letters or by telegrams, and who go about in closed motor cars. Such a fictitious society might be called a completely abstract or depersonalized society. Now, the interesting point is that our modern society resembles in many of its aspects such a completely abstract society. Although we do not always drive alone in closed motor cars, the result is very nearly the same as if we did. We do not establish, as a rule, any personal relation with our fellow pedestrians. Similarly, membership of a trade union may mean no more than the possession of a membership card and the payment of a contribution to an unknown secretary. There are many people living in a modern society who have no, or extremely few, intimate personal contacts, who live in anonymity and isolation, and consequently in unhappiness. For although society has become abstract, the biological makeup of man has not changed much. Men have social needs which they cannot satisfy in an abstract society. Another way in which the picture is exaggerated is that it does not, so far, contain any of the gains made, only the losses. But there are gains. Personal relationships of a new kind can arise where they can be freely entered into instead of being determined by the accidents of birth. And with this, a new individualism arises. Quote, "In the light of what has been said, it will be clear that the transition from the closed to the open society can be described as one of the deepest revolutions through which mankind has passed. Owing to what we have described as the biological character of the closed society, this transition must be felt deeply indeed. Thus, when we say that our Western civilization derives from the Greeks, we ought to realize what it means. It means that the Greeks started for us that great revolution which, it seems, is still in its beginning, the transition from the closed to the open society. 2. The strain of civilization. Of course, this revolution was not made consciously. The breakdown of tribalism, of the closed societies of Greece, may be traced back to the time when population growth began to make itself felt among the ruling class of landed proprietors. This meant the end of organic tribalism, for it created social tension within the closed society of the ruling class. At first, there appeared to be something like an organic solution of this problem, the creation of daughter cities. But this ritual of colonization only postponed the breakdown. It even created new danger spots wherever it led to cultural contacts. And these, in turn, created what was perhaps the worst danger to the closed society: commerce, and a new class engaged in trade and seafaring. By the 6th century BC, this development had led to the partial dissolution of the old ways of life, and even to a series of political revolutions and reactions. And it had led not only to attempts to retain and to arrest tribalism by force, as in Sparta, but also to that great spiritual revolution, the invention of critical discussion, and in consequence of thought that was free from magical obsessions. At the same time, we find the first symptoms of a new uneasiness. The strain of civilization was beginning to be felt. What the strain is? This strain, this uneasiness, is a consequence of the breakdown of the closed society. It is still felt even in our day, especially in times of social change. It is the strain created by the effort which life in an open and partially abstract society continually demands from us, by the endeavor to be rational, to forego at least some of our emotional social needs, to look after ourselves, and to accept responsibilities. We must, I believe, bear this strain as the price to be paid for every increase in knowledge, in reasonableness, in cooperation, and in mutual help, and consequently in our chances of survival, and in the size of the population. It is the price we have to pay for being human. The strain is most closely related to the problem of the tension between the classes, which is raised for the first time by the breakdown of the closed society. The closed society itself does not know this problem. At least to its ruling members, slavery, caste, and class rule are natural in the sense of being unquestionable. But with the breakdown of the closed society, this certainty disappears, and with it all feeling of security. The tribal community is the place of security for the member of the tribe. Surrounded by enemies and by dangerous or even hostile magical forces, he experiences the tribal community as a child experiences his family and his home. The breakdown of the closed society, raising as it does the problems of class and other problems of social status, must have had the same effect upon the citizens as a serious family quarrel, and the breaking up of the family home is liable to have on children. Commerce, empire, and class war. Perhaps the most powerful cause of the breakdown of the closed society was the development of sea communications and commerce. Close contact with other tribes is liable to undermine the feeling of necessity with which tribal institutions are viewed, and trade, commercial initiative, appears to be one of the few forms in which individual initiative and independence can assert itself, even in a society in which tribalism still prevails. These two, seafaring and commerce, became the main characteristics of Athenian imperialism as it developed in the 5th century BC. And indeed, they were recognized as the most dangerous developments by the oligarchs, the members of the privileged or of the formerly privileged classes of Athens. Much evidence of this development can be found in Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. When reading Thucydides, we must never forget that his heart was not with Athens, his native city. Although he apparently did not belong to the extreme wing of the Athenian oligarchic clubs who conspired throughout the war with the enemy, he was certainly a member of the oligarchic party, and a friend neither of the Athenian people, the demos, who had exiled him, nor of its imperialist policy. Quote, "Nearly the whole Hellenic world was in commotion. In every city, the leaders of the democratic and of the oligarchic parties were trying hard, the one to bring in the Athenians, the other the Lacedaemonians. The tie of party was stronger than the tie of blood. The leaders on either side used specious names, the one party professing to uphold the constitutional equality of the many, the other the wisdom of the nobility. In reality, they made the public interest their price, professing, of course, their devotion to it. They used any conceivable means for getting the better of one another, and committed the most monstrous crimes. Everywhere prevailed an attitude of perfidious antagonism. There was no word binding enough, no oath terrible enough to reconcile enemies. Each man was strong only in the conviction that nothing was secure. Thucydides, Athens, and the myth of cultural intolerance. I mentioned above that Thucydides himself was an anti-democrat. This becomes clear when we consider his description of the Athenian Empire and the way it was hated by the various Greek states. Such statements are only expressions of the anti-democratic point of view. Many facts recorded by Thucydides show that Sparta was popular not among the peoples of Greece, but only among the oligarchs, among the educated, as Meyer puts it so nicely. Even Meyer admits that the democratically minded masses hoped in many places for her victory, i.e., for the victory of Athens. It is most interesting that the same historians who hail Rome for her achievement, the foundation of a universal empire, condemn Athens for her attempt to achieve something better. Athens, they believe, was a ruthless democracy, a place ruled by the uneducated. The myth of the cultural intolerance of democratic Athens makes nonsense of the known facts, and above all of the astonishing spiritual productivity of Athens in this particular period. Pericles, who was the democratic leader of Athens at this time, was more than justified when he called her the school of Hellas. I am far from defending everything that Athens did in building up her empire, but it is necessary, I believe, to see that tribalist exclusiveness and self-sufficiency could be superseded only by some form of imperialism. Certain of the imperialist measures introduced by Athens were rather liberal. For instance, Athens offered to her ally Samos that the Samians should be Athenians from now on, and that both cities should be one state, and that the Samians should order their internal affairs as they chose and retain their laws. And whatever one might say against plutocracy, it is preferable to a rule of looters. Sparta's program and modern totalitarianism. This favorable view of Athenian imperialism can be supported by comparing it with the Spartan methods of handling foreign affairs. The principles of Spartan policy were these. 1. Protection of its arrested tribalism. Shut out all foreign influences which might endanger the rigidity of tribal taboos. 2. Anti-humanitarianism. Shut out, more especially, all equalitarian, democratic, and individualistic ideologies. 3. Autarky. Be independent of trade. 4. Anti-universalism or particularism. Uphold the differentiation between your tribe and all others. 5. Mastery. Dominate and enslave your neighbors. 6. But do not become too large. If we compare these 6 principal tendencies with those of modern totalitarianism, then we see that they agree fundamentally, with the sole exception of the last. Summing up our analysis so far, we could say that the political and spiritual revolution, which had begun with the breakdown of Greek tribalism, reached its climax in the 5th century, with the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. It had developed into a violent class war, and at the same time, into a war between the 2 leading cities of Greece. 3. The patriotic reaction. But how can we explain the fact that outstanding Athenians like Thucydides stood on the side of reaction against these new developments? Class interest is, I believe, an insufficient explanation. For what we have to explain is the fact that, while many of the ambitious young nobles became active members of the Democratic Party, some of the most thoughtful and gifted resisted its attraction. The main point seems to be that although the open society was already in existence, although it had, in practice, begun to develop new values, new equalitarian standards of life, there was still something missing, especially for the educated. The new faith of the open society, its only possible faith, humanitarianism, was beginning to assert itself, but was not yet formulated. The reaction against these developments had, therefore, much on its side: tradition, the call for defending old virtues, and the old religion. From the slogan of the movement, back to the state of our forefathers, or back to the old paternal state, derives the term patriot. It is hardly necessary to insist that the beliefs popular among those who supported this patriotic movement were grossly perverted by those oligarchs who did not shrink from handing over their own city to the enemy, in the hope of gaining support against the Democrats. Thucydides was one of the representative leaders of this movement for the paternal state. Although the patriotic movement was partly the expression of a longing to return to more stable forms of life, to religion, decency, law, and order, it was itself morally rotten. Its ancient faith was lost and was largely replaced by a hypocritical and even cynical exploitation of religious sentiments. Nihilism, as painted by Plato in the portraits of Callicles and Thrasymachus, could be found if anywhere among the young patriotic aristocrats. The clearest exponent of this nihilism was perhaps the oligarchic leader who helped to deal the death blow at Athens, Plato's uncle Critias, the leader of the 30 tyrants. 4. The Great Generation. But at this time, in the same generation to which Thucydides belonged, there rose a new faith in reason, freedom, and the brotherhood of all men. The new faith, and, as I believe, the only possible faith of the open society. This generation, which marks a turning point in the history of mankind, I should like to call the Great Generation. It is the generation which lived in Athens just before and during the Peloponnesian War. There were great conservatives among them, like Sophocles or Thucydides. There were men among them who represent the period of transition, who were wavering, like Euripides, or skeptical, like Aristophanes. But there was also the great leader of democracy, Pericles, who formulated the principle of equality before the law and of political individualism, and Herodotus, who was welcomed and hailed in Pericles' city as the author of a work that glorified these principles. Protagoras and his countryman Democritus must also be counted among the Great Generation. They formulated the doctrine that human institutions of language, custom, and law are not of the magical character of taboos, but man-made, not natural, but conventional, insisting, at the same time, that we are responsible for them. Then there was the school of Gorgias, Alcidamas, Lycophron, and Antisthenes, who developed the fundamental tenets of anti-slavery, of irrational protectionism, and of anti-nationalism, i.e. the creed of the universal empire of men. And there was perhaps the greatest of all, Socrates, who taught the lesson that we must have faith in human reason, but at the same time beware of dogmatism, who taught, in other words, that the spirit of science is criticism. Quote, "Our political system does not compete with institutions which are elsewhere in force. We do not copy our neighbors, but try to be an example. Our administration favors the many instead of the few. This is why it is called a democracy. The laws afford equal justice to all alike in their private disputes, but we do not ignore the claims of excellence. Our city is thrown open to the world. We never expel a foreigner. We consider a man who takes no interest in the state not as harmless, but as useless, and although only a few may originate a policy, we are all able to judge it. We do not look upon discussion as a stumbling block in the way of political action, but as an indispensable preliminary to acting wisely. To sum up, I claim that Athens is the school of Hellas. These words are not merely an eulogy on Athens. They express the true spirit of the Great Generation. They formulate the political program of a great equalitarian individualist, of a democrat who well understands that democracy cannot be exhausted by the meaningless principle that the people should rule, but that it must be based on faith in reason and on humanitarianism. Pericles' speech is not only a program. It is also a defense and perhaps even an attack, directed not only against the arrested tribalism of Sparta, but also against the totalitarian ring at home, against the movement for the paternal state, the Athenian Society of the Friends of Laconia. Only 5 or 6 years after Pericles' oration, a pamphlet on the Constitution of Athens was published by an unknown author, possibly Critias, now usually called the Old Oligarch. This ingenious pamphlet is, at the same time, perhaps the oldest monument of the desertion of mankind by its intellectual leaders. Its central idea is the close connection between naval imperialism and democracy, and it tries to show that there can be no compromise in a conflict between two worlds, the worlds of democracy and of oligarchy. That only the use of ruthless violence, of total measures, including the intervention of allies from outside, the Spartans, can put an end to the unholy rule of freedom. Unwilling and unable to help mankind along their difficult path into an unknown future which they have to create for themselves, some of the educated tried to make them turn back into the past. Incapable of leading a new way, they could only make themselves leaders of the perennial revolt against freedom. It became the more necessary for them to assert their superiority by fighting against equality, as they were misanthropists and misologists. Incapable of that simple and ordinary generosity which inspires faith in men and faith in human reason and freedom. V. Socrates and the democratic criticism of democracy. The greatest contribution to this faith was to be made by Socrates, who died for it. Socrates was not a leader of Athenian democracy, like Pericles, or a theorist of the open society, like Protagoras. He was, rather, a critic of Athens and of her democratic institutions, and in this he may have borne a superficial resemblance to some of the leaders of the reaction against the open society. But there is a fundamental difference between a democratic and a totalitarian criticism of democracy. Socrates' criticism was a democratic one, and indeed of the kind that is the very life of democracy. Democratic versus totalitarian criticism. Democrats who do not see the difference between a friendly and a hostile criticism of democracy are themselves imbued with the totalitarian spirit. Totalitarianism cannot consider any criticism as friendly, since every criticism of such an authority must challenge the principle of authority itself. The closed society, and with it its creed that the tribe is everything and the individual nothing, had broken down. Individual initiative and self-assertion had become a fact. A philosophy which makes man the center of its interest began only with Protagoras. And the belief that there's nothing more important in our life than other individual men, the appeal to men to respect one another and themselves, appears to be due to Socrates. Socrates insisted that man is not merely a piece of flesh, a body. There is more in man, a divine spark, reason, and a love of truth, of kindness, humaneness, a love of beauty and of goodness. It is your reason that makes you human, that enables you to be more than a mere bundle of desires and wishes, that makes you a self-sufficient individual and entitles you to claim that you are an end in yourself. Socrates saying care for your souls is largely an appeal for intellectual honesty, just as the saying know thyself is used by him to remind us of our intellectual limitations. These, Socrates insisted, are the things that matter. And what he criticized in democracy and democratic statesmen was their inadequate realization of these things, their lack of intellectual honesty, and their obsession with power politics. Why Socrates associated with anti-democrats? If Socrates was fundamentally the champion of the open society and a friend of democracy, why did he mix with anti-democrats? First, his attack upon the democratic politicians was carried out partly with the purpose of exposing the selfishness and lust for power of the hypocritical flatterers of the people. Young aristocrats who posed as democrats but looked upon the people as mere instruments of their lust for power. Second, Socrates, the moralist and individualist, would never merely attack these men. He would take a real interest in them and hardly give them up without making a serious attempt to convert them. Third, Socrates went out of his way to attract young men and to gain influence over them, especially when he considered them open to conversion. Alcibiades, Critias, Charmides. Socrates, though one of the leading spirits of the open society, was not a party man. But these connections were to cause his death, the fall of Athens, and the trial. The history of the Peloponnesian War and the fall of Athens is still often told in such a way that the defeat of Athens appears as the ultimate proof of the moral weaknesses of the democratic system. But this view is merely a tendentious distortion. The main responsibility for the lost war rests with the treacherous oligarchs who continuously conspired with Sparta. Prominent among these were three former disciples of Socrates, Alcibiades, Critias, and Charmides. After the fall of Athens in 404 BC, the two latter became the leaders of the 30 tyrants. But the Democrats fought on. During the 8 months of Critias' reign of terror, the death roll contained rather a greater number of Athenians than the Peloponnesians had killed during the last 10 years of war. But after 8 months, Critias and the Spartan garrison were attacked and defeated by the Democrats. The peace reestablished democracy in Athens. Thus, the democratic form of government had proved its superior strength under the most severe trials. As soon as the restored democracy had reestablished normal legal conditions, a case was brought against Socrates. He was accused of having had his hand in the education of the most pernicious enemies of the state, Alcibiades, Critias, and Charmides. Because of the amnesty, the charge could not openly refer to these notorious cases. The prosecutors probably sought not so much to punish Socrates for the unfortunate political events of the past, as to prevent him from continuing his teaching. Socrates insisted that he had no sympathy with the policy of the 30, and reminded the jury that among his closest associates there was at least one ardent Democrat, Chaerephon, who fought against the 30. It is now usually recognized that Anytus, the Democratic leader who backed the prosecution, did not intend to make a martyr of Socrates. The aim was to exile him, but this plan was defeated by Socrates' refusal to compromise his principles. He had never intended to undermine democracy. In fact, he had tried to give it the faith it needed. This had been the work of his life. Quote, "I am the gadfly that God has attached to this city, and all day long and in all places I am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you. You would not readily find another like me, and therefore I should advise you to spare me. If you strike at me, as Anytus advises you, and rashly put me to death, then you will remain asleep for the rest of your lives, unless God in his care sends you another gadfly." 6. Plato's betrayal of Socrates. Socrates had only one worthy successor, his old friend Antisthenes, the last of the great generation. Plato, his most gifted disciple, was soon to prove the least faithful. He betrayed Socrates, just as his uncles had done. Plato tried to implicate Socrates in his grandiose attempt to construct the theory of the arrested society, and he had no difficulty in succeeding, for Socrates was dead. If we look upon the Apology and the Crito as Socrates' last will, and if we compare these testaments of his old age with Plato's testament, the Laws, then it is difficult to judge otherwise. Socrates had been condemned, but his death was not intended by the initiators of the trial. Plato's Laws remedy this lack of intention. Here he elaborates coolly and carefully the theory of inquisition, free thought, criticism of political institutions, teaching new ideas to the young, attempts to introduce new religious practices or even opinions, are all pronounced capital crimes. In Plato's state, Socrates might have never been given the opportunity of defending himself publicly. I cannot doubt the fact of Plato's betrayal, nor that his use of Socrates as the main speaker of the Republic was the most successful attempt to implicate him. After the Peloponnesian War, the strain of civilization was felt as strongly as ever. Critias' attempt to destroy democracy by carrying out the program of the old oligarch had failed, not through lack of determination, but largely because it had offended the citizens' sense of justice. The defeat had been largely a moral defeat. The faith of the great generation had proved its strength. The 30 had nothing of this kind to offer. They were moral nihilists. Plato felt that a complete reconstruction of the program was needed. 7. Plato's diagnosis and the revolt against freedom. Plato's strongest argument in this struggle was, I believe, sincere. According to the humanitarian creed, he argued, we should be ready to help our neighbors. The people need help badly. They are unhappy. They labor under a severe strain, a sense of drift. There is no certainty, no security in life when everything is in flux. I am ready to help them, but I cannot make them happy without going to the root of the evil. And he found the root of the evil. It is the fall of man, the breakdown of the closed society. This discovery convinced him that the old oligarch and his followers had been fundamentally right in favoring Sparta against Athens. But they had not gone far enough. Plato knew better. Tyranny was not the solution. Although it is imperative to keep the people in their place, their suppression is not an end in itself. The end must be the complete return to nature, a complete cleaning of the canvas. The difference between Plato's theory on the one hand and that of the old oligarch and the 30 on the other is due to the influence of the Great Generation. Individualism, equalitarianism, faith in reason, and love of freedom were new, powerful, and dangerous sentiments that had to be fought. Plato had himself felt their influence, and, within himself, he had fought them. His answer to the Great Generation was a truly great effort. It was an effort to close the door which had been opened, and to arrest society by casting upon it the spell of an alluring philosophy, unequaled in depth and richness. Pareto's secret in aesthetic holism. Plato discovered, perhaps unconsciously, the great secret of the revolt against freedom, formulated in our own day by Pareto, to take advantage of sentiments, not wasting one's energies in futile efforts to destroy them. Instead of showing his hostility to reason, he charmed all intellectuals with his brilliance, flattering and thrilling them by his demand that the learned should rule. Although arguing against justice, he convinced all righteous men that he was its advocate. Not even to himself did he fully admit that he was combating the freedom of thought for which Socrates had died, and by making Socrates his champion, he persuaded all others that he was fighting for it. This dream of unity and beauty and perfection, this aestheticism and holism and collectivism, is the product as well as the symptom of the lost group spirit of tribalism. It is the expression of and an ardent appeal to the sentiments of those who suffer from the strain of civilization. In reading Plato, we are, I feel, witnesses of an inner conflict, of a truly titanic struggle in Plato's mind. Nowhere does this inner struggle reveal itself more clearly than in the Menexenus, that sneering reply to Pericles' funeral oration. This is how Plato makes his Socrates maliciously describe the impression made upon him by Pericles' oration. A feeling of exultation stays with me for more than 3 days. Not until the 4th or 5th day, and not without an effort, do I come to my senses and realize where I am. Who can doubt that Plato reveals here how seriously he was impressed by the creed of the open society, and how hard he had to struggle to come to his senses and to realize where he was, namely, in the camp of its enemies. 8. The lesson Plato teaches by negative example. Socrates had refused to compromise his personal integrity. Plato, with all his uncompromising canvas cleaning, was led along a path on which he compromised his integrity with every step he took. He was forced to combat free thought and the pursuit of truth. He was led to defend lying, political miracles, tabooistic superstition, the suppression of truth, and ultimately, brutal violence. In spite of Socrates' warning against misanthropy and misology, he was led to distrust man and to fear argument. In spite of his own hatred of tyranny, he was led to look to a tyrant for help and to defend the most tyrannical measures. He did not succeed in arresting social change. Instead, he succeeded in binding himself, by his own spell, to powers which once he had hated. Quote, "The lesson which we thus should learn from Plato is the exact opposite of what he tries to teach us." Excellent as Plato's sociological diagnosis was, his own development proves that the therapy he recommended is worse than the evil he tried to combat. Arresting political change is not the remedy. It cannot bring happiness. We can never return to the alleged innocence and beauty of the closed society. Our dream of heaven cannot be realized on earth. Once we begin to rely upon our reason and to use our powers of criticism, once we feel the call of personal responsibilities, and with it, the responsibility of helping to advance knowledge, we cannot return to a state of implicit submission to tribal magic. For those who have eaten of the tree of knowledge, paradise is lost. It is an issue which we must face squarely, hard though it may be for us to do so. If we dream of a return to our childhood, if we're tempted to rely on others and so be happy, if we shrink from the task of carrying our cross, the cross of humaneness, of reason, of responsibility, if we lose courage and flinch from the strain, then we must try to fortify ourselves with a clear understanding of the simple decision before us. We can return to the beasts. But if we wish to remain human, then there's only one way, the way into the open society. We must go on into the unknown, the uncertain and insecure, using what reason we may have to plan as well as we can for both security and freedom. Quote, He will restore us to our original nature, and heal us, and make us happy and blessed. Conclusion. Volume I of the Open Society and Its Enemies. The Spell of Plato is, I believe, best read as a single sustained argument about how the myth of destiny becomes a political program. Popper begins by isolating historicism, the conviction that history is governed by discoverable laws whose mastery would let us prophesy mankind's fate. The doctrine of the chosen people supplies the simplest model. Heraclitus, reacting to the breakdown of tribal aristocracy, generalizes flux yet comforts himself with an inexorable cosmic law and a verdict of history and war. Plato inherits both the feeling of drift and the historicist remedy, a law of decay, a perfect, unchanging form behind the degenerating copy, in a state designed to arrest change altogether. What looks like philosophy of nature is, at bottom, sociology under strain, an attempt to stop the Heraclitean movement that democratic Athens had unleashed. The middle books of the volume expose that program in its institutional logic. Methodological essentialism turns political concepts into hidden essences knowable only to experts. Totalitarian justice redefines merit as function within a natural class hierarchy. The question, who should rule, displaces the democratic question of how to prevent bad rulers from doing harm. The philosopher king, lover of truth only in the sense that rulers may lie while subjects must not, is breeder, lawgiver, and inquisitor, a self-portrait of the sage who copies divine originals onto a canvas that must first be cleaned by expulsion, purge, and indoctrination. Utopian social engineering, with its blueprint of the whole society and its aesthetic hunger for a beautiful new world, is not an accidental excess, but the natural method of a politics that treats human lives as means to an arrested perfection. I do not think Popper's demolition is merely antiquarian. The Republic's propaganda lies, racial myth, educational monopoly, and hostility to piecemeal reform read, in his hands, as a coherent totalitarian theory wearing the mask of wisdom and justice. Against this closed ideal, Popper sets the brief, historical miracle of the open society's birth. From tribal magic and taboo through the widening field of personal decision, Athens produced the Great Generation. Pericles' equalitarian individualism, Protagoras' and Democritus' conventionality, Lycophron's protectionism, Socrates' democratic criticism of democracy. The strain of civilization, the anxiety, drift, and longing for lost certainty that accompany freedom and responsibility, provoked a patriotic reaction. The old oligarch's ruthless either-or, Critias' nihilism, Thucydides' paternal state. Socrates died trying to supply democracy with the intellectual honesty it lacked. Plato, his most gifted pupil, betrayed him by making Socrates the spokesman for the very inquisition that would have silenced him. The Menexenus and the laws are, on Popper's reading, the receipts of that betrayal. The closing lesson is deliberately inverted. Plato's sociological diagnosis, that social change and dissension cause deep unhappiness, and that intellectuals may be tempted to relieve the strain by abandoning reason and responsibility, is, Popper grants, often penetrating. His therapy is worse than the disease. We cannot return to tribal innocence. Paradise is lost for those who have eaten of the tree of knowledge. The open society remains insecure, demanding, and permanently exposed to enemies who promise certainty, unity, and a beautiful, arrested world. Volume I, therefore, ends not with a prophecy of inevitable progress, but with a decision. We may retreat toward the beasts, or we may go on into the unknown using what reason we have, piecemeal, critically, without posing as prophets of destiny. The later volumes will trace how other historicist systems renew the same spell. Here the spell is named, and Plato is shown, by negative example, to be its most formidable ancient caster. Key persons discussed. Plato, heir to a noble family scarred by the Peloponnesian War and the rule of the 30 tyrants. Architect of the theory of forms, the arrested state, and the philosopher king. Popper treats him as a totalitarian party politician of genius, whose sincere wish to heal social sickness led him to betray Socrates and to cast the spell of an alluring philosophy over the revolt against freedom. Socrates, moral individualist and gadfly of Athens, champion of intellectual honesty, self-criticism, and democratic criticism of democracy. He died for faith in reason and the open society. Popper distinguishes his equalitarian intellectualism sharply from Plato's authoritarian Socrates of the Republic. Heraclitus, first major Greek historicist of flux, discovered universal change yet clung to an inexorable law of destiny and a tribal ethic of fame and the great man. His anti-democratic reaction to social revolution prefigures, Popper argues, the emotional structure of later historicism. Pericles, leader of democratic Athens and voice of the great generation, formulated equalitarian individualism, equality before the law, and the principle that discussion is an indispensable preliminary to wise action. His funeral oration is the positive political program against which Plato's closed city is directed. Protagoras, sophist of the great generation, held that institutions of language, custom, and law are man-made conventions for which we remain responsible. Popper credits him with a critical dualism that Plato's conventionalism and religious propaganda later subvert. Lycophron, associate of the Gorgian school, advanced a rational protectionist doctrine of the state as arbiter between individuals who are by nature unequal in strength but equal in legal protection. Popper treats his fragmentary argument as a landmark of open society individualism that Plato's totalitarian justice is designed to defeat. Critias, Plato's uncle, leader of the 30 tyrants, an exponent of religion as a lordly lie for the clever statesman. He embodies the moral rot of the patriotic reaction and foreshadows Plato's own use of propaganda and inquisition. Antisthenes, Socrates' old friend, and, in Popper's view, his only worthy successor among the great generation, where Plato proved the least faithful. Aristotle, reported by tradition as the source of Plato's turn from flux to essential definitions. Popper cites him mainly to explain methodological essentialism and to note that later essentialists need not locate essences in separate forms, a foreshadow of arguments developed beyond Volume 1. Karl R. Popper, authorial stance, critical rationalist, opponent of historicism and utopian engineering, advocate of piecemeal democratic reform and of learning from mistakes rather than prophesying destiny. He writes as one who admires much in Plato while bent on destroying what he considers mischievous in the spell. Key works discussed: The Republic, Plato's central political dialogue, and, for Popper, a topical manifesto of the closed society, natural class rule, educational monopoly, the myth of the metals, breeding programs, censorship, and the demand that philosophers become kings. Popper reads its Socrates as a deliberate implication of the historical Socrates in a program the real man would have rejected. The Laws, Plato's late testament, elaborating inquisition, capital penalties for free thought and religious innovation, and a theory that would have denied Socrates a public defense. Popper contrasts it with the Apology and Crito as evidence of Plato's betrayal. Statesman and Timaeus, sources for Plato's Law of Decay, the Great Year, and the father-mother form analogy that ties political arrest to cosmology. Popper uses them to show how historicist sociology and methodological essentialism interlock. Apology and Crito, treated as Socrates' last will, appeals to intellectual honesty, lawful dissent, and the gadfly's democratic function. Popper sets them against the Laws as the ethical antipode of Platonic totalitarianism. Menexenus, Plato's parody reply to Pericles' funeral oration. Popper reads it as an involuntary confession of how deeply the open society's creed impressed Plato before he came to his senses in the enemy camp. Constitution of Athens, the Old Oligarch, anonymous pamphlet, possibly by Critias, arguing that democracy and naval imperialism form one unholy world irreconcilable with oligarchy. the intellectual desertion of mankind that Plato's program radicalizes rather than repudiates. The Open Society and Its Enemies, Volume 1. Karl R. Popper, 1945. Popper's own framing work. Not a system of metaphysical history, but a collection of critical notes on historicist philosophies, written to clear obstacles to rational, piecemeal social reform and to expose the Platonic roots of totalitarian thought. Index of core concepts. Historicism, the doctrine that the social sciences must discover laws of history and furnish long-term prophecies about mankind's destiny if they are to be useful at all. Popper argues that such prophecy exceeds scientific method, flatters intellectuals, discourages democratic reform, and may relieve men of the strain of personal responsibility, while still leaving room for sincere historicists who do not intend that effect. Closed society, the tribal or magical society in which custom and taboo leave little room for personal decision and critical reflection, and in which the individual is submerged in the group. Popper treats it not as a mere past stage, but as a permanent temptation renewed whenever the strain of civilization makes return to certainty and unity seem desirable. Open society, the society that sets free the critical powers of man, widening the field of personal decisions, distinguishing conventional from natural regularities, and institutionalizing reform without violence. It is young, fragile, and permanently exposed to reactionary movements that promise to heal unhappiness by arresting change and restoring tribal unity. Tribalism, the collectivist emphasis on the supreme importance of the tribe, class, or collective, without which the individual counts for nothing. In Volume I, it appears in the doctrine of the chosen people, in Heraclitus' ethic of fame, and in Plato's demand that citizens know their place within a natural hierarchy reproduced by racial myth and breeding. Strain of civilization, the sense of drift, insecurity, and moral disorientation produced when the closed society breaks down and individuals must bear responsibility in an unknown future. Popper treats this strain as real and diagnostically important, the fuel of historicism and of Plato's revolt against freedom, while insisting that no return to tribal innocence is possible or desirable. Methodological essentialism, the view that science must discover the hidden nature, essence, or form of things, knowable by intellectual intuition and definable in words, rather than describing regularities in how things behave. Plato's theory of forms is its great founding move in politics. Popper contrasts it with methodological nominalism and blames essentialism for much backwardness in the social sciences. Forms, theory of ideas, Plato's perfect, eternal originals of which sensible things are degenerating copies. Methodological device, theory of change and decay, and blueprint for social engineering aimed at arresting flux. Popper admires the philosophical ambition while attacking the use of forms to sanctify class rule, racial purity, and the suppression of criticism. Totalitarian justice, justice redefined as the health, stability, and functional hierarchy of the whole, each part doing its natural work without question. Equalitarian, individualist, and protectionist doctrines are reinterpreted as chaos or as the selfish rationalization of the weak. Humanitarian language is enlisted, Popper argues, to defeat humanitarian politics. Who should rule? Plato's fatal question, which invites answers like the best, the wisest, or the philosopher king, and diverts attention from institutional safeguard against bad rulers. Popper replaces it with the democratic problem of designing checks, elections, and removable governments so that incompetence or tyranny cannot do irreparable harm. Philosopher king, Plato's fusion of political might and possessive wisdom, dialectician as breeder, propagandist, and director of education who may lie for the city's benefit while forbidding truthfulness in the ruled. Popper reads the Republic's portrait as Plato's self-portrait and as a decline from Socratic irony to shamanistic power. Utopian versus piecemeal social engineering. Utopian engineering demands a blueprint of the whole ideal state before action, centralizes power, discourages criticism, and risks canvas-cleaning violence. Piecemeal engineering fights identifiable evils one institution at a time, permits learning from mistakes, and seeks agreement on suffering that can be reduced now rather than on a distant perfect good. Nature versus convention/critical dualism. The distinction, developed by Protagoras, Democritus, and the open society sophists, between natural inequalities and man-made institutions, language, custom, law, for which we are responsible. Plato's conventionalism, by contrast, invents natural class divisions and religious lies that mask political artifice as destiny. Equalitarianism and protectionism. The great generation's commitments to equality before the law, political individualism, and the state's role as protector of the weak against the strong, notably in Lycophron and Pericles. Plato's program, Popper argues, is a conscious attempt to defeat these tendencies and re-establish tribal hierarchy under the name of justice. Great generation. The generation of Pericles, Herodotus, Protagoras, Democritus, and Socrates, conservatives, skeptics, and Democrats who first articulated the faith of the open society in reason, freedom, and the brotherhood of men. Their brief triumph and subsequent betrayal by intellectual leaders frame the tragedy volume I tells. Aestheticism and canvas cleaning. Plato's artist-politician ideal, composing the city for beauty's sake by expelling citizens, erasing customs, and beginning on a clean canvas. Popper connects this aesthetic holism to utopian radicalism and warns that the reformer who would wipe society clean must destroy the very standards and persons that make reform conceivable. Democratic versus totalitarian criticism. The distinction between friendly, institutional self-correction within democracy and hostile criticism that challenges the principle of authority itself. Socrates exemplifies the former. Plato's implicated Socrates and the law's inquisition exemplify the spirit that cannot tolerate free thought. Reading comprehension questions. How does Popper define historicism? And why does he treat the question of method, whether sweeping historical prophecy is scientifically possible, as prior to debating any particular prophecy? In what sense does Heraclitus both discover universal flux and reintroduce an unchanging law of destiny? And why does Popper treat that combination as characteristic of historicism generally? What three functions does the theory of forms serve in Plato's philosophy according to Popper's analysis? And how does each function support the project of an arrested state? How does Plato's law of decay connect cosmic change with political program? And what does Popper mean by calling the perfect state the arrested state? Distinguish totalitarian justice from equalitarian and protectionist theories. How does Plato, on Popper's reading, use humanitarian language to oppose humanitarian politics? Why does Popper regard who should rule as a misleading central question of politics? And what alternative problem does he propose democratic theory should address first? What is the difference between Socratic intellectualism and Platonic authoritarianism in education? And how does the Republic's Socrates illustrate that difference? Explain the myth of the metals and Popper's argument that Plato's philosopher king is a breeder king whose racialism opposes democratic humanitarianism. Contrast utopian and piecemeal social engineering with respect to risk, criticism, and the testability of reforms. Why does Popper connect utopianism with aesthetic canvas cleaning? What is the strain of civilization? And how does Popper use the Great Generation, the old oligarch, and Critias to explain the patriotic reaction against the open society? Why does Popper call Socrates' trial a democratic tragedy rather than proof of democracy's weakness? And in what sense does he think Plato betrayed Socrates after the amnesty? Critical probe. Popper grants Plato genuine benevolence and penetrating sociological diagnosis. Does this concession strengthen or weaken his charge of totalitarianism? And can a philosophy be both sincerely therapeutic and irredeemably dangerous? Critical probe. If piecemeal engineering avoids the risks of blueprints, does it also foreclose necessary large-scale reforms, e.g., abolition of slavery or universal suffrage? How might Popper answer from within Volume I's argument? Critical probe. Popper reads the Republic's use of Socrates as deliberate propaganda. What evidence would count against this reading? And where does Popper himself admit limits to his interpretation? Further observations. Historicism's plausibility, Popper insists, rests on a false assimilation of scientific prediction to historical prophecy. Yet the habit is so entrenched that even disappointed historicists who renounce prophecy often retain the prejudice that social science must be prophetic or it is useless. The doctrine of the chosen people is valuable in volume I chiefly as a template. Remote ends, unfalsifiable interpretations, and collectivist submergence of the individual recur, Popper suggests, whenever tribal certainties collapse and intellectuals offer destiny in place of institutional experiment. Heraclitus shows that anti-democratic politics and historicist metaphysics can arise from the same biographical wound. The loss of assigned place in a rigid aristocratic order, which should make us wary of treating either as purely abstract philosophy detached from social strain. Plato's genius, on this reading, lies in taking the historicist's fear of flux and answering it with a program that appears technological, educational design, eugenics, state medicine, while smuggling historicist essences and destiny in through the back door of the forms. Totalitarian justice is especially insidious because it does not simply reject morality, but redefines virtue as function within hierarchy, thereby recruiting the language of health, harmony, and wisdom against equalitarian reform without ever openly debating equality. The principle of leadership reveals a persistent confusion in political thought. Asking for the best ruler feels responsible, while quietly removing the institutional question of how to survive the worst ruler. A confusion Popper believes Plato crystallized for Western politics. Platonic education is not a neutral transmission of skill, but the selection mechanism of a closed succession. Once schooling holds the keys to power, demands that only experts may judge experts become arguments against democracy rather than for enlightenment. Utopian engineering's aesthetic appeal, the beautiful new gown rather than the patched old garment, is not ornamental but motivational. It explains why intelligent people accept canvas-cleaning violence they would reject if proposed as incremental repair, because holism transforms politics into art and citizens into clay. The open society's birth in Athens was not a smooth evolution, but a contested breakthrough in which taboo-bound tribal life gave way to personal decisions, conventionalist insight, and democratic institutions still needing Socratic criticism to become worthy of their promise. Socrates' association with Alcibiades and Critias is the tragedy Popper refuses to simplify. The open society's critic must engage the gifted and dangerous young, yet democratic enemies used those associations to silence the very voice that might have strengthened democracy's moral intelligence. Plato's betrayal is measured not only by the law's inquisition, but by the rhetorical triumph of making authoritarianism speak with Socrates' irony and moral authority. A lesson, Popper thinks, in how totalitarian movements borrow the symbols of the civilization they undermine. The negative lesson of volume I is deliberately austere. Diagnosis of social suffering does not license anti-rational therapy, and those who offer certainty, unity, and arrested perfection in exchange for freedom should be judged by whether their cure destroys the patient, the critical faculties without which no open society can endure.